Religion is about a lot more than God, and that is more visible in India than anywhere else. I'm a non-believer, and if belief in God was all there was to religion, then I could just ignore it. But there's much more to it than that. Religion can give people a sense of community, often even unity, and shapes cultures and cuisines and art. On the flip side, it can play to our worst tribalistic instincts and divide people just as it can unite them. I often say on the show that people contain multitudes, or India contains multitudes, and when it comes to religion, this is actually more true of India than perhaps any other place in the world. All the religions in the world exist here, even thrive here, and we have more gods and goddesses in India than even spices. And indeed, the one area that most reflects this incredible melting pot of a nation is our food. And whether or not you believe in God, I think we can both agree that Indian food can be divine. And religion has played a part in that.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is a prolific columnist and author, Shoba Narayan. Shoba has just come out with a fascinating book called Food and Faith, A Pilgrim's Journey Through India. In Food and Faith, Shoba travels to 15 places of worship in the subcontinent and writes about the food you get there. Now, this is not just a book about travel or food, it's also about our history and our society. And it worked for me at multiple levels, mainly because the author's own explorations, her intellectual and emotional journey, was so much a part of the writing. I was delighted to have Shoba on the show, and we had a freewheeling conversation that is as much about religion and Indian society as about food. I found it, in more ways than one, to be a mouth-watering discussion. Before we begin, though, let's take a quick commercial break. As many of you know, I'll soon be coming out with a 4-volume anthology of the Seen and the Unseen books, organized around the themes of politics, history, economics, and society and culture. These days, I'm wading through over 3 million words of conversation from all my episodes so far to curate the best bits. And for this to happen, I needed transcripts. And that was made possible by a remarkable young startup called TapChief. TapChief at tapchief.com is a digital platform that allows companies to outsource work to their network of freelancers. And TapChief's network includes more than 125,000 people as of now. You want people to make you a web page or design a logo or compose a jingle or do some digital marketing for you. TapChief gives you an easy way to reach out to freelancers competing for your work. I can say from first-hand experience how valuable this has been for me and solved a problem I was actually a bit worried about. So do go over to tapchief.com and check out all that TapChief has to offer. Maybe they could solve your problem too. Shoba, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thank you so much for having me, Amit.
Shoba, I loved reading your superb book. But before we kind of get to the book, I'm also sort of fascinated by your journey, in the sense that I've read your column for many years in Mint and so on. And whenever I read anything by you, I mean, the 3 things I would typically associate you with are food, travel, and writing. And of course, you write a lot about food and travel. But you've also, done journalism in Colombia and so on. So tell me a little bit about your background and your sort of journey of, living in different places in the world and how that affected what you do.
I grew up in Chennai, and I was one of those kids who knew early on that I wanted to be a writer. Even while I was in college, in Women's Christian College in Chennai, I used to write for the Indian Express, and Aside. There was this wonderful magazine called Aside in Chennai, which was run by Janaki Venkatraman. And those days there were no emails, so I walked up to her and said, "Can I write for you?" And she agreed. And I used to write columns occasionally for the Indian Express, which at that time was edited by Raj Mohan Gandhi. So very illustrious man, as you know. So as a college student, I wrote. As a school student, I wrote poetry. So I was one of those kids who just has written all her life. I took a detour in college. When I went abroad to complete my undergraduate, I studied art and sculpture, and I have since developed an interest in that. I went to a women's college there too, called Mount Holyoke, where I did art. And then after a master's in fine arts, I finally returned to journalism at the Columbia J School. It was a 1-year program. It was a boot camp in many words. You had to ride in the back of a police car to do police reporting. You had to go to the criminal courts to write about law and trials and things like that. But I have always been drawn to memoirs. And my first break in food writing came when the New York Times announced a competition. They took a half-page ad and said, write 150 words about food. And if your essay is chosen by Ruth Reichel, who was then the restaurant critic of the New York Times, we will give you $1,000 coupon to use as you wish. So as an impoverished student, the appeal of getting $1,000 to dine in New York was very irresistible. So I discovered, Amit, writing 150 words and making an essay in that, in some ways harder than writing 850 words, which is what you and I do for our newsletters and blogs and a column. So condensing a narrative in 150 words was difficult. I did it and I won the prize. I should have dug up the essay, which I could have read to you, but it was about India, 1986. I want to study in America, but my grandparents will not allow me. Finally, the elders decide that they will ask me to prepare a feast, one that they are sure I will fail because I don't know cooking. And so I take up the challenge and then I describe the feast, and each line had, so there was bindi roasted in oil with fennel seeds, and then there was the rasam piping hot with a sprinkling of coriander leaves on top. There was rice served with streams of mist on top and ghee, golden ghee. So essentially it was a practice in food writing. It was a practice in describing food in a very condensed way. So when I won the award, I got this $1,000 coupon, which I dined away. And Ruth Reichel, who went on from the Times to edit Gourmet, which is the late great Gourmet, as I call it, she said, why don't you expand this 150-word essay and make it into 1,500 words? And that was how the food writing began. They called it The God of Small Feasts, and it was published in Gourmet. And beginner's luck, it won this James Beard Award for the MFK Fisher Award for Distinguished Food Writing was and that was how I first learned about MFK Fisher, and I went on to read her book. And then just kept writing about food for Food and Wine, Bon Appetit, Gourmet while I was in Manhattan, and then moved to India and wrote about food as well for Mint.
Wow, that's quite a mind-blowing story. And to do it in 150 words seems to me almost impossible. Like when I teach my writing course, I'll often quote Blaise Pascal's famous quote about when he wrote a letter to someone and he said, quote, apologies for sending you a long letter. I did not have time to write you a short one. Stop quote. So,
yes.
I think anyone who's ever written to a word count or a deadline knows exactly how hard it is. So, and while you were describing it to me just now, even though I just had my brunch, my mouth was kind of watering right away. So, what is it that drew you to food writing in particular? Like, was it that this challenge came up and you liked food and you liked writing and you said that, okay, I'll, combine these two and try it out? Or were you already reading food writers? If so, who were the writers, food writers and otherwise, who you really enjoyed and thought that they might, shine a light on the kind of writing that you want to do? So what was that process of evolving as a writer and then as a food writer? Because it strikes me that, when one starts writing about food, you'll sort of begin by writing about the sensory experience of the food, the smells, the taste, the look of it, all of that. But then you move on, as indeed you have in this book, you move on to the wider cultural and social significances and the resonances that food carries. So, was that there from the start or is that something that you kind of, that evolved within your writing as well?
Thank you. So, Amit, as you know, there are two types of food writing. One is the writing of recipes and cookbooks, and the other is the kind of work that I do. I'm not a good cook in my kitchen, and I stumbled on food writing. Unlike writing in general, where I was one of those kids who wrote, food writing didn't come naturally to me. While in Chennai, I wrote about sabas and music and, whatever the editor assigned me to do. Food writing literally was a break, a fortunate happenstance, a discovery of a skill that I didn't know existed because all in pursuit of $1,000 of a food coupon. And since then, I have worked at it. I think food writing is different from cooking. I don't think the two are together. In order to write about food, you don't need to be a good cook. You need to have a good palate. And as MFK Fisher said, you need to have the capacity to eat prodigious amounts of food. And as you are eating it, to think about it. You need to have taste and you need to have good eye to observe. So Meenakshi Ammal's classic book, Samaitapar, which every Tamilian has and carries as 3 volumes, is a precision. It is about use of this particular type of rice cooked to this particular amount of. And she even describes how the Tamil word is aatardu, which means to make cool. There are ways in which you make cool before. For example, in Tamil cooking, there is a dish called beans parapusli, which is beans in which you put the chanaka dal and you grind it and then you put it in. And then you steam it. And then she describes how you cool it. In the olden days, my grandmother would put it out on a rice cloth, an old torn dhoti, and cool it. So that is a very precise type of kubuk kind of observation, how you cool, how you cook, how long you cook, and what is the smell that emanates when the idli is done. The kind of writing I do involves being, to quote Isaiah Berlin, the fox and the hedgehog. You need to have a wide spectrum. The surface area has to be quite large, and you need to be able to connect history and philosophy and feminism for me and sensuality and India. So that's what my kind of writing does. And how did I cultivate that skill is, I think, that reading a lot, as you say. I was introduced after writing to all the big American writers, and K.T. Achaya is a must read if you are an Indian food writer. I read Vikram Doctor's columns religiously. I read Harold McGee, who wrote an encyclopedia about food. And then, I have a long list. While in Gourmet, one of the pleasures was to be exposed to food writers. So Fuchsia Dunlop's books on Chinese cooking is one that I read. Michael Pollan, of course, although now he's overused, everybody reads him. There's a wonderful book called The Man Who Ate Everything, written by Jeffrey Steingarten. He was the food columnist for Vogue, and he wrote this fantastic book of essays called The Man Who Ate Everything. And in it, for example, he will take French fries and he will conduct experiment to see which is the best kind of French fry and how you make it. So those are that. I loved a book called Feast, the Food of the Islamic World by a woman called Anissa Helu, and if I'm pronouncing it right. And what was fantastic about that is, as a vegetarian, you tend to basically keep away. You think that books that focus on non-vegetarian food are not useful to you. But this book, for example, even though I don't eat meat kebab, she places them side by side and then describes how a Turkish kebab is different from a Iranian kebab, from an Iraq kebab in Iraq. And it was an experience of description of the kind that is very useful to me, and of history and milieu and stories and community and family and cooking. Cooking comes last in a way. So that was good. And then once you get into it, again, Vikram's columns will introduce me to Manaso Lasa. These are Sanskrit texts from the old. K.T. Achaya talks about it a lot. So these are the things I read. And then there's an Indian book by Colleen Taylor Senna called Feasts and Fasts. That's a wonderful book because it anchors in food history in India in a very scholarly way. So, for example, there are recipes for barbecued rat, and there are recipes that basically convince you that we were not the prudes that we have become in terms of our attitude towards animals, certainly the cow, and our attitudes towards meat, and our attitudes towards cooking, and this whole purity and non-purity that has invaded Brahminical kitchens since. So that was good. So I can give you a longer list if you like, but that's a start.
Yeah, and you've actually, with this answer, you said you can't cook, but you've provided a feast of reading for my listeners and for me, because I'm sure many of these books are now going to get gobbled up by us. And of course, we share our admiration of Vikram Doctor. He's a good friend. He's been on the show, in fact, talking about the Indianness of Indian food was the name of the episode. And it was all about almost how everything that we consider Indian is from somewhere else. So I kind of have a question also about how writing about something can shape a person. Like at the obvious level, like this is again a sort of a two-part question. It's really the same question, but two different directions. And one is obviously that one would expect that when you begin writing about food, obviously your palate will get more refined because you will pay more attention and be more mindful about all the individual things that go into what you're eating and the processes and so on. So did that happen with you? And the second part is the kind of food writing that you have done would also then mean that you're not only expanding your palate, but you're also expanding your mind because you want to make these cultural connections, these social connections, historical connections, all of that. I would imagine that it then, incentivizes you to read much more widely and almost in that sense then become a different person than who you would have been if you weren't a food writer. Is there something to that?
The short answer, Amit, is that yes, it changed my palate. It changed my palate in a very specific way. It forced me to pay attention to what I was eating instead of just gobbling it up. So it also defined in sharp focus that I was losing a whole spectrum of taste because I happen to be a vegetarian and I have not been able to eat meat or fish or chicken. A friend of mine said this best. He said, eat meat if you want to just before you die, because then the amount of time that you'll spend regretting will be the least. So that said, I realized that a spectrum is lost to me. But what being vegetarian does is that it forces you to pay attention to all the other flavors because you're losing out on something. So how do you eat is the question. How do you eat if you want to write about food? And how do you take notes? How do you keep mental notes? Very slowly. Start by eating very slowly. Start by savoring the food. And I think that restaurant menus, for example, I always read them because they give me a way of, in India less so, but certainly in other countries, you can tell the chef's influence on the menu in the way they have written it. So, for example, braised, does he use the word boiled or braised potatoes? Does he use the word sauteed beans or does he use stir-fried? What is the taste difference between? Just like computer technology has very specific words, cooking has specific words. And the question I always face is it reflected in the taste of the food? Chinese food, for example, is entirely about braised, sauteed, vegetable, cabbage. So take the cabbage and do it 4 different ways and see how it tastes differently. The other thing I always pay attention to is the environment, and restaurants are a great place for that. For example, in India, there is a notion that the chef or the cook's temperament matters, which is why if you go to Hare Krishna kitchens or if you go to temple kitchens, they will chant the Lord's name, for example, or there will be peaceful music playing in the background. Some of my grandparents' friends, they would not eat outside food because they said, in Tamil we call it Yenna Padirigal. Yenna Padirigal means the thought stamp of the chef matters and it will influence how you eat and it will influence your body. I have interviewed chefs in New York. You go into restaurant kitchens of Daniel Boulud or John George or it is a hellhole. People are screaming, people are cursing. The food that comes out is sublime. So that's the other thing, is that the milieu matters. How does the chef's temperament get translated to the waiter who describes the food to us? There's that whole chain, and I pay attention to that and how it does it. And the way, what people choose. I studied psychology in Women's Christian College as an undergraduate. There was a very cool study where people would look at the menu and the first person, if they call out what you want, you will sort of be forced to call out something else, even if you actually wanted that dish to be different. So the psychology of ordering of food in restaurants, or the psychology of eating, is what I pay attention to. History is a very obvious one, but that doesn't come in the act of eating. When the act of eating, it is about using the fork or the spoon and using the hands, the tactility of the fingers, which is how we eat. The culture that invented chopsticks, and why did China invent chopsticks as opposed to the spoon? So those are the kinds of questions you ponder while you are at the table. And I love eating at restaurants, and because of all these things. The history comes afterwards. The history is not linked to a dish, in my view. The history is linked to a cuisine. So the Middle East is fascinating to me because I think some of the best writers of Middle Eastern cuisine are women, but it's such a male-centric culture. So how did that happen? And then learning about, for example, there was a wonderful cookbook called the Syriana Cookbook, and by Latika George, I believe it was. And the Syrian Christian food is heavily fish-centric. I don't eat fish, But what you got out of that cookbook was the milieu of Syrian Christians. And as somebody who spent a lot of time in Kerala, it was a wonderful read for that reason. So to answer your question about palate cultivation, I think slowing down and paying attention, making connections as disparate as you can would be the three things I do. In terms of how it has expanded me, is that the slowing down, paying attention, savoring, making disparate connections force you to, each of those has like a 4-factor output, which forces you to read 4 different types of books or come back and research 4 different types of things. So that's what it is.
That's fascinating. My other sort of observation about a lot of your writing is that in one sense, even when you're writing about food, it is like in this book, I got this sense in more senses than the fact that you just went to all these different sites, but that it's a travel book. And it's not just a travel book in the sense that it is about travel. It is your travel book in the sense that it is about your journey, not just your sort of physical journey through space, but also how you are evolving and changing. Now, before I kind of get to the book, what I was wondering about was that you've lived in different countries at different parts of your life. You have also written extensively about, first settling into America, then, coming back to India and settling in here. And it strikes me that someone who travels like that, who is sort of, in a sense, I wouldn't say uprooted because these are all choices that you made, but someone who chooses to live somewhere else and then come back somewhere else, is forced to do something that others who stay in one place are not, which is to constantly re-examine themselves, re-examine their sense of self, their self of identity, and all of that, which in the context of religion, obviously, there's a lot of in this book, which I'll ask you later. But in a general sense, what has that kind of exploration been like? Because it always strikes me that, we always assume that individuals are what individuals are, right? As if it's, you are a fixed person at a given point in time. But the point is that, if you had a different set of experiences, you would be a fundamentally different person. How do you think all of this shaped you? Was it easy to settle into another culture? How did it make you look at your own identity as an immigrant and as someone born a Hindu? Did it make you more open? Did it, like some immigrants to the US, for example, become more assertive about their cultural roots and all of that? Tell me a little bit about how that journey happened for you.
So the gift of being an immigrant is that you straddle 2 cultures or 3 cultures all the time. And it forces you to compare, which is a gift for a writer, because really writing is about the best way to illustrate what you want to say to your reader, as you just did with Blaise Pascal, is to compare or show the other. The curse of being an immigrant is that you are always a Trishanku. You don't have roots. So that has broadly been my life. And I think it's helpful for me because I grew up, till I moved to America at age 20, I was a Chennai girl. And as I know from your previous podcast, but Krisha Shok, for example, Chennai is a very rooted city. It is conservative. It used to be when I was growing up, but that was a gift because it gave you a certain set of parameters that were unchanging and that you thought was true for the rest of the world. So you go from that to America, where I lived for the next 18 years. So 18 years Chennai, 18 years America, where I was moving all around. So I sometimes wonder, Amit, I went as a fresh off the boat person and landed in Massachusetts in a very liberal college. And as a result, I became a Democrat by philosophy. And I was just thinking, had I landed in Memphis or Georgia, would my philosophy and politics have become Republican? I have no answer to that, but I think those are the kinds of questions that I ask, is that, am I a Democratic, am I liberal because of where I landed? And I think what happens when you are hungry to leave your hometown, as I was, Chennai, it was stifling to me because I grew up in a fairly large family where everybody had an opinion about how much oil I should put in my hair and how long the hair should be, what I should eat, and how I should dress. So I was ready to just flee. And when you go and land as a tabula rasa, which I was, and so open, the influences, you're like a child, you're like an infant, and the influences, they shape you, and as they shaped me, I think my deep-rooted sort of reflexive taking up for the underdog, whoever the underdog is of the moment, comes from my time in Massachusetts, which is very liberal and democratic and has a strong social conscience. My liberal politics, feminism. Mount Holyoke is one of the seven sisters. So I went from a mother who said a woman is like a creeper and you have to sort of creep and bind yourself to your new family, to this place where feminism was argued, and I am a feminist. So I think for anyone who leaves home, whether within a country, like a lot of my friends in Bangalore have come from the north or a different country, it forces you to take your parents and your family and your community off that pedestal and see them for the people with clay feet, people you love, but people with clay feet that they are. And it forces you to question everything. And I think that is the point of going away from home. And some of us take advantage of it, as I did, and some of us don't. And I think we fear it. We fear the change. So a lot of Indians who went to America in the 60s and 70s became more Indian and became more encapsulated within their culture. And I wasn't like that. I didn't see the point of living abroad if you were not. And being an artist helped. So my friends were gay people. My closest friend was a lesbian who colored her hair purple. So, so if you don't take the arts, and if no matter, but I think once you have a family, then there's a tendency to go inward and kind of freeze yourself when you left India. That's what happens to a lot of Americans. After that, I moved to Singapore, which is a different sort of experience. Singapore was a bubble. It had the gift of three fantastic cooking cultures, which was the Arab cooking, the Chinese cooking, and the Indian cooking. So it had that. But other than that, living in Singapore as an immigrant was a bubble life. And then I had a choice of moving to Chennai or Bangalore, but my husband could not stand Chennai summers or the heat. So we ended up in Bangalore. It's a very genteel, welcoming city. It is a city of immigrants. So I'm happy that I landed here. So I think that being an immigrant forces you to examine and question constantly. It is a state of dissatisfaction, really, most of your time. And for a person to live with that angst is not a happy thing, but it helps with the writing.
Yeah, I'll take a detour here and point out something which I loved about your book, which is that it's full of so many light touches. It's got a conversational tone. And I was just reminded of that when you mentioned having gay friends and a lesbian friend. And there's a delightful anecdote in your book about, how your lesbian friend was once accosted by another girl who wanted to convert her to Christianity and said, why don't you come out and talk with me for a couple of minutes? And your friend told that girl that I'll come out with you, but here's the thing, either you'll save my soul or I'll seduce you. So I found that so kind of delightful. And your book is full of these light, charming moments that, make a person LOL. So despite, so if any of my listeners are not interested in either food or faith, you can still have fun. So that's sort of your third F there for you. Let's kind of now go closer to the book. Like, you've described this book as a book about Hinduism written by a skeptical Hindu. Now, before we talk about the book and about Hinduism, I want to talk about the skeptical Hindu. In your afterword, you write about how, quote, religion is an inheritance and a choice, stop quote. And it's interesting how it shifts from one to the other for you. Like, you've written about how as a teenager you were an atheist, then agnostic in your 20s and 30s, and you turned to religion again, later in life. So much so that in the introduction of this book you wrote, quote, it defines who I am, perhaps not as much as feminism, and certainly not as much as being a writer or a mother, stop quote. And there's tons to unpack here, but I'll just ask you about religion and per se that, what has been the role of religion in your life, and what's kind of, just as you've made a physical homecoming by, settling in India, it seems that your journey with regards to religion has also, gradually come that kind of circle, though not fully. So tell me a little bit about the role religion has played in your life and the different ways in which you think about it.
So my mother is what is called a Sri Vidya Upasaka, by which I mean it's a feminine goddess cult. So I grew up with this, Amit. I grew up in a home which was, she became this after my brother and I left home. she said she caught hold of religion when her children left home. Possibly that is a trajectory that many people will follow because most people take to religion when they get older. I am similar in that. So I'm not, and the bell-shaped curve, I'm sort of in the middle. In terms of the usefulness of religion, a long time ago, maybe 2 decades ago, there was a cover story in Time magazine about religion, and it made this case about how people who had faith, and it was largely Christian faith because Time magazine is for the Western world, and there was a whole slew of benefits that were listed out. You will have better marriages, you will have better health, you will have better relationships within the community, your immunity will be higher. And again, these are narratives that keep coming up. Now they say if you keep a gratitude journal, you will have this, this, and this, and this. But I remember I was not part of the self-help genre. I was not paying attention to that. But so this really sort of caught me out of the blue and said, my God, if Time magazine says religion is so great, I better start looking at it. And I shelved it away and I just didn't pay attention. But so you have two strands. One is because my mother was so deeply spiritual, I sort of rebelled against it. And then intellectually seeing the benefit of faith. But then faith, as I have come to learn, is a felt experience. It's not a cerebral experience. It is a visceral experience. And I'm not there yet. I think it would be wonderful to have that visceral experience where monks in the Kumbh Mela have experienced transcendence. When they see the Ganga, they just, and here we are saying, in California, drugs have become legal. Imagine if you can achieve that without drugs. So that's what religion did for you. And I've seen it time and time again in India. Now, okay, so let's say I've come to a point where I admit faith as an idea into my life. Which faith? Buddhism and Hinduism are both seductive to me. Monotheistic faiths don't attract me as much. Hinduism is a marvelous faith because of it is a faith that still has not given up its very ancient animistic roots where rocks are worshipped, where trees, we have sacred, Nandita Krishna has written this wonderful book on sacred trees and sacred groves. We are original tree huggers. We are the original rock worshippers and river worshippers. And that connects us not just to our own Vedic past, but to past in Egypt, where, the pyramids were built. My father passed away recently, and the death ceremonies that surround an Indian death are very similar to sending off a pharaoh to the next life. So we sent my father off with a cow image, with an umbrella, with slippers, with clothes, with his favorite foods. I think that's so wonderful. The rituals that I disdained as a child are so meaningful to me now that we are living more and more in a world where our life is shorn of meaning. Life has been the vestiges of the rituals that connected us to milestones. African cultures, when a man reaches a certain age, would send them off to the hunt, and they would have these markings and tattoos on it. We still have that, but we have forgotten them. So if you admit faith as essential to your well-being, as I have come to believe, then you have to choose your faith. And as an adult, you can. And I chose the faith that I was born into. I haven't found enough to give it up. And I like the fact that there are women goddesses. There aren't too many faiths in which there are women goddesses. I think that was a key element which makes me like Hinduism. And I specifically like the Hinduism of the left-handed path, as my mother would call it, which is there in Bengal, which is there in Kerala, which is there in Nepal. When I went to see the goddess, the left-handed god is tantric. It embraces what Carl Jung calls the shadow, which is the quote-unquote the so-called bad parts of yourself, the things that you suppress. It embraces sacrifice, animal sacrifice. It embraces blood, wine, madhu. The goddess drinks blood and wine. It embraces all the things that have been sanitized out of, the, how shall we call it, the middle path Hinduism. So I like the left-handed path. I like Chinnamasta as a tantric goddess who cut off her head and dances on corpses. So the reason to embrace faith is intellectual for me. The reason to embrace Hinduism is the marvelous variety And the fact that I am interested in Carl Jung and dreams and transcendence and and the whole, marijuana, if you have to say it, and the effects of it thereof. And the fact that people in Bangalore, Amit, one of the most interesting things that I've attended recently is a fire walking ceremony. And if you like, we can talk about that.
Yeah, we'll come back to it. There's so much to unpack here. And this is what kind of fascinates me about everything that you've just said and which you've written about in your book is this notion of faith, of the instrumental qualities of faith, where you point out that, like you point to the Time magazine article, that it can help us lead more fulfilled lives and we are happier and so on and so forth, thereby pointing out how faith is useful. I mean, faith is important because it is useful. It doesn't matter if it's true or not, as long as it's useful. And this brings me to a very interesting thought, because I often get semantic about, atheism and agnostic. People think of them as separate points on a continuum. But you can actually be atheist and agnostic at the same time, because atheism has to do with belief. And an atheist is someone who has an absence of belief. He doesn't believe that there's no God. There's simply an absence of belief. Much as, not collecting stamps is not a hobby, similarly, it's not a belief itself, it's an absence. And while atheism deals with belief, agnosticism deals with knowledge. And what it means is an agnostic holds a position that you cannot know whether there is God or not. There is epistemic humility. So it is possible to be both an atheist and an agnostic if you look at it technically, because you can both not believe and at the same time accept that there are some things you cannot know. And the interesting addition to that is that besides being an atheist and an agnostic, you can now be a person of faith also, because without believing and accepting that you cannot know, you can still embrace faith because of the utility it has in your life, and that sense that you're part of a community, the comfort that you get from these rituals and traditions. I mean, in fact, just thinking aloud, it reminds me of a book by Stephen Landsberg called The Big Questions, in which he says that most people who profess to believe in God actually don't believe in God. They say they believe, but if it comes to the crunch, so again, I mean, it seems to be coming from the way of thinking that, hey, religion is useful even if it isn't true. So what's your sense of, you've been to all these places, you've mingled with all these religious people, in the sense of this kind of balance between usefulness and belief? What are your observations?
So I both agree and disagree with Karl Marx's statement about religion being the opiate of the masses, or the opium of the masses. He was right. It has the benefit of comfort and otherworldliness that a drug gives. But what touched me was the way a devotee, the truly faithful, deals with God. Has nothing to do with mass. It's a very particular thing. I saw women in Ironies doing Anga Pradashanam, where you roll around the temple and saying Muruga, Muruga. And it was from her face, from her demeanor, from the supplicancy with which she rolled, and from the eyes which were tuned in with God. She was not paying attention to the surroundings. You could tell the fervor with which she believed that if she did this particular thing, that her problem, whatever that specific problem was, whether it was son or a daughter being sick, would be solved. So it is a connection, this sort of connection I envy, and I saw this countless times. I mean, mostly in South Indian temples, because I could tune in very quickly to the nuances of it. So you go to Ambalapura, the palpaisam was made for the god, and the priest would go out every day and call out, Vasudeva, Vasudeva, 3 times. And you're calling as if you're calling your son who is playing in the cricket field, and I know you're writing a book on cricket, to come back. So it is a feat of imagination. And the word that is used by my mother is bhavana, bhavanai in Tamil. So assume you're a skeptic like I am. Why not cultivate faith just to improve your imagination is the question I have. I mean, I think there are many ways to do it. The art of drawing, there are books about it, and there are, lots of people in the West who've made a fortune by teaching you how to cultivate your creativity. But rituals are a great way where you can look at a grain of rice and see a universe. You look at a stone and see the Shiva, the destroyer of the universe. you hold the Nataraja pose in your Bharatanatyam and then you become that goddess, as so many Bharatanatyam dancers in Chennai demonstrate. And the best Kathak, as my friend Madhu Nataraj in Bangalore tells me, some of the finest Kathak choreographies or the creations were done by a Muslim Nawab who pretended he was Krishna and or Radha. So these are flights of fancy that will help you no matter what area of life that you would like to be part of. So there are two things I find that religion is about. You take it all now. So one is bhavna or imagination. The other is sharanagati or self-surrender. Self-surrender has to do with, it's not about giving up on free will. It is about applying for a job at Apple or Microsoft, doing the best you can. And then, having this faith, which Ramanujan, the mathematical genius, had, is that something is beyond my spectrum that will help me. And devotees have that. And usually they are down and out. Usually somebody is sick. It is visiting a temple is, if you go beyond the praying and everything, it is about being caught in a quagmire of hopes and dreams. You stand in the temple, in any temple, and you're surrounded by murmuring people. And it's as if you are in a cloud of dreams, fear, and hope. And they've all come to this one place to solve it, to solve their problems. And if you are a feeling person like me, you will feel that. And then that's the transition from cerebral to visceral. And I truly believe what Diana X said in all her books about the Tirtha Yatra. Yatra is a crossing. And the more you go, more you subjugate yourself, the more you get rid of this ego mind and get into the feeling mind, you will be touched. And as I was. And it is a privilege to be touched in that way.
And I'm very sort of intrigued by the role of both rituals and food in that. I mean, food, of course, is a part of some rituals also, but, deep associations with each of these places, and we'll kind of talk about some of them. But what it kind of, again, strikes me is that, again, when I teach my writing course, to go back to that, I'll often tell the people who participate that if you want to, one useful hack in terms of building a routine is build a ritual around your writing. So, in the sense that you get up at the same time, you make a cup of coffee, you sit at the same place, you listen to the same playlist, and you're more likely to get into the writing groove. And the reason for that is actually a scientific one. Neurologists would say neurons that fire together, wire together. So when these things kind of come together, they can work together. And it seems that there is a deep truth there which religion hit upon, because you have all of these things coming together. You have ritual coming together, you have food coming together, you have, certain ways of doing things, different customs in different places, like the Sufis in Ajmer may, whirl and do all of those things. You have these separate, distinct rituals. And it therefore strikes me that it doesn't really matter whether there is a God or not, or whether, what the religion holds out as facts are true or not. What is true is that all of these, they can come together and they can kind of put you in a particular state of mind, which can, as you so eloquently put it, make the whole experience visceral. In fact, I was going to ask you earlier when you were talking about how food can be affected by how it's presented and everything around it. You've mentioned at one point in your book that if you were asked, if you had one meal to have before you left the planet, what would you have? And you mentioned breakfast in Haridwar, especially their samosas. Do you think part of the reason that food tasted so good to you is everything that was around it as well? So are all these things also part of religion, that religion is not just about the bland fact of there being a God and everything associated with that, but all of these local things also play a part in that?
100%, Amit. I think that this is why they say when we offer it to the God, we call it Nevedyam, and it becomes prasadam or prasad after the God has blessed it. And 100%, I believe the taste of the food, the divinity associated with it, the feeling that what you are having is with God's blessing, contributes to your well-being. So I actually, after these trips of mine, I have started looking at this notion of the energy around the food, energy around the cook a little bit more carefully. Haven't come to a conclusion yet, but I actually think there is something to the fact what we Hindus have discovered in India and what the faithful have discovered in every faith is that the milieu surrounding the food and its preparation matter, and it makes a difference. And it is a subtle difference. Perhaps we have lost the art of recognizing it, but I have come to believe there is a difference. And I am trying in small ways to figure out experiments to figure out that difference. But I wanted to add, I'm sure if you haven't done this already for your students, the Paris Review interviews, which are available online for free, I'm sure you know them, but they are great examples of the routines and superstitions that writers develop. And one that stuck to my mind was of Ernest Hemingway, of course, is the great one who wrote, and when the writing was good, he would stop and then go out drinking and come back the next day and wrote. But the other one was, I think Dan Brown got these shoes that were anti-gravity shoes and would sort of hang on the ceiling upside down as a writing ritual routine. But that was for your students. And yeah, and I think I've answered your other question about the taste.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. In fact, I do cite the Writers at Work series as, the Paris Review interviews were called. To my students, I talk about the Hemingway interview also because he said some really interesting things in there. I haven't read the Dan Brown interview, but I now will. And this is probably a good time then to, before we get down to the book, to talk about the craft of writing. Like, you are someone who's been a prolific columnist. You've kind of written all these years. You've also written a bunch of books. So what is kind of the process like? What is the column process like? Do you face writer's block? Do you have hacks to deal with it? And, how has, looking back over the years, how has sort of your craft evolved and the way you approach? I mean, let's talk about columns first. Can you give me some insight on that?
Yeah. So I'll go from the details to the broader one.
Sure.
I actually believe in Hemingway's words, kill your darlings. So if you write a paragraph that you're very proud of, you need to look at it again and you need to kill your darlings, by which he meant that when you fall in love with your own writing, examine it with a little bit more critical eyes. I also, small things like don't use the same word in the same paragraph or within two or three sentences. The thesaurus should be your best friend because it will actually force you to look at. So if you're struggling for a word, look at it in thesaurus. It may enlighten you on how to actually present it. The beginning and the end are the most important aspects of a column, especially the end, because ideally in this age of sound bites, think about coming up with a sound bite, a one-line sound bite which encapsulates your column. That will be probably the most important sentence you write. Like a poker player, don't reveal your hand all at once. So a New York Times editor once told me that in the first paragraph, you've pretty much written the whole essay. Don't reveal your hand so much. So do it gradually, do a little bit of zigzag to maintain the tension. These are the things that all of us learn once you do it enough. As far as my column, Raju Narasetti, who is known to both of us, described my column. He was my first editor, and he said it is using the small everyday act to come up with a big picture. So that has been sort of how I approach column writing, where you use simple things to come up with a bigger philosophical, whether it's philosophical or a larger picture. And that's how I think, and that's how I view the column. What do I do for that? So there are many kinds of columnists. You are one who links events to philosophy. I am not an event to philosophy person, partially because I'm not a politics junkie like so many columnists are in this country. I am much more of a everyday things, small things, linking it to bigger truths. So that in that itself, there are two types of columnists. If you would like to be Amit Varma type of columnist, I have no words for you. If you would like to be sort of a humorist, a little bit playful, again, what I said about seeing the universe in a grain of sand type of columnist, I would say, first of all, when you stand in a line, don't look at your smartphone. Talk to people around you. When you're going to buy fruits, try your best not to use, after COVID, stop ordering on Amazon, actually go out to your mandi and find people. Because in order to write about life, as I do, you have to engage with life. And more these days, it's become very easy to sit at home and look at the computer all day. And the problem with that is that you won't get flashes of insight, which only come when you are bored, when your mind is idle. And you have to force yourself to give yourself that moments of idleness when you're not checking your smartphone. So for example, a few things I have done. I removed Facebook, Twitter, all from my phone. I go through large phases of the month when I disengage email, which is easy to do if you have a smartphone. I mute WhatsApp messages. So notifications muting is a very important thing. I love my phone. So if you're addicted to checking your phone as I am, at least mute the notifications. Whenever possible, forget your phone at home when you go out. So these are ways in which you engage with the present when you engage with people. Talking to people is a good one. Try to compartmentalize your life so that your writing time, do the Pomodoro. I use the Pomodoro technique, which is 20 minutes without surfing the internet and stuff like that. I used to have an app called Freedom, which is installed where it basically shuts off your computer and you can't open Chrome and nothing will happen. So I have been known to do that. Usually the way I write a column, and I did a weekly column for Mint, was that be on the lookout for an idea that is somewhat topical because nobody cares about. So essentially have attention for festivals that come up, have some notion of what's going on in the world, and tangentially be on the lookout for that idea. And usually the idea would percolate. I would make notes longhand on A4 paper. And because you're on deadline, I would sit down to write the column and pretty much finish it in the span of a day. 800 words is easy to do in a span of a day if you have enough notes. Sometimes there were times when there would be writer's block, but one study actually helped me. Study was examining the words of people who were forced to write and the words of people who wrote when the muse was sitting on their shoulder. So basically it got a control group of say 50 people and said, okay, write. And then the experimental group of 50 people who were told, okay, write when you have the urge to write. And the output was, there was no difference. So I said, I don't feel like writing. This is bad writing. All the negative narratives that come into your head, I used to think of that study and said, you know what? I may think this is stupid and bad, but the output when people look at it, guess what? That study said there'll be no difference. So that's how I forced myself to write. So I think attention is the most important thing a writer has. What you train your attention to focus on is priceless for a writer. And so make it count, focus attention on things that matter. I mean, go to kacheris or go to concerts, because guess what? There are a few places when insight will strike. Everybody says shower. I get insight when I listen to Hindustani music or Carnatic music. And I think the sitting back and letting your mind wander is a very special thing. And you have to figure out ways to do that. Whether you end up being a bird watcher like me and standing in the balcony and looking out, or you're a runner, runners are a great place. Figure out a way for you to be bored.
This is all fantastic and very wise advice, especially that bit about how, if you're forced to write a lot, that'll actually help you, because the one thing that I keep saying is that what leads to excellence? Iterations lead to excellence. You keep doing something again and again and again and again. And that's much more likely to happen if you force yourself to do it rather than if you just sit around and wait for the muse to strike you, as you said. And, since you sort of now created this framework of Amit Varma kind of columnist and Shoba Narayan kind of columnist, I would just tell my readers that please don't be an Amit Varma kind of columnist, because people who write about politics and economics do nothing to change the world. But being a Shoba Narayan kind of columnist gives you a shot at changing the way people live their lives in, all the small pleasures, like some of the things you pointed out, and indeed about eating food. And now it's time to talk about your book, but let's take a quick commercial break and come back after that. On The Seen and the Unseen, I often speak about positive sum games. Well, if you want to be surrounded by beauty and you love fine art, I have a win-win proposition for you. Head on over to IndianColors.com. Indian Colors licenses images of fine art from some of the best contemporary artists in India and adapts them to objects of everyday use like tote bags, pouches, and home decor items. You get to surround yourself with the finest modern Indian art at affordable prices, and artists get royalties for every product you buy. Win-win game. The Indian Colors new range is in and includes elegant yet comfortable dresses for women and casual shirts for men, with standout motifs by artists such as Tanmoy Samanta, Manisha Gera Baswari, Shruti Nelson, Pradeep Mishra, and Jaideep Mehrotra. Stay home, but dress smart. And if you're missing your friends in these lockdown days, worry not. You can show them you're thinking of them by buying gifts for them from Indian Colors. Corporate gifting is also available. So head on over to IndianColors.com, that's colors with an OU, and make art a part of your life. And hey, for a 15% discount, use the code UNSEEN. That's right, Unseen for 15% off at indiancolors.com. Welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Shoba Narayan about her delightful book, Food and Faith. Shoba, we've spoken a lot about your personal journey before the break. And now as we come to the book, I'd like to sort of begin by asking you, how did you conceive of this book? Like, you've written about food before in the past throughout your career. You've spoken about your sort of relationship with religion and how it gradually changed. But how did the idea for this particular book actually come about, and how did you decide to approach it?
So the food writing angel was Ruth Reichel, who sparked my career in food writing. As far as the faith goes, about right after my first book, Monsoon Diary, which is called a memoir with recipes, had come out, an editor from India, Kamini Mahadevan, who used to be with Penguin at that time, took me out for a coffee. I was living in New York then. And she said, "You've written this book on food, and Penguin has published it in India. Why don't you write a book called Sacred Food? And we'll come up with a list of temples, and you will visit the temples and write about the sacred food." So this was 2003, and it's taken me this long to come for the book to actually be finished because I was moving continents and countries at that time. So Kamini's vision of the book was largely Hindu and with a Ajmer Dargah and a few others. I pretty much stuck to her vision. And the way the logistics of it coming out was me pitching Sukumar at Mint and Sidin at Mint, saying I will write essays about this for Mint on Sunday, which was at that time taking off. So some of the chapters were published in Mint, and then a lot of the other stuff was added on by me, the research and the Kumbh Mela, for example, all that, the Nepal chapter. So there were many chapters that were not written about for Mint before. So that was how it came about. And it was choosing the temples became a big dilemma. For example, Tirupati Balaji temple's laddus are very, very famous, and I chose not to include them because a lot had been written about them. There's a Jain temple which serves Sukri Prasad, so that was an obvious miss. That was partly because for whatever reason, I couldn't visit that temple, and I believe that everybody says the God has to call you. Well, I wasn't called, so that was an obvious miss. Partly, Prasad there was no way for it to be without seeming forced, so that was a miss. So that was how it happened. So thanks to a editor.
And what was your experience like of going to all of these temples? Like some of them, like you pointed out when you were young and you were actually growing up in Chennai, you had visited some of these in the past because your family was fairly religious. But now you're visiting them again and looking at them in a different way. In a sense, one could, if there's a throng of people at the Kumbh Mela or at, the Jagannath temple in Puri or wherever you are, one could actually shine a spotlight from on high on you and say that here's someone who's looking at all of this very differently from everybody else, that you're taking a step back, you're getting meta, you're trying to be descriptive, you're focusing your attention, as it were. So what was that process like? Like, as a writer who's writing about all of this, do you think about possible narratives in mind? Do you do pre-research and kind of go there? What are you looking at? What are you looking for?
Yeah, so yes, definitely a lot of pre-research in the choice of the temples and also how to approach each temple, which was different. India has this wonderful thing called Sthala Purana, which is the regional story of that particular temple. The problem with that is most of those books are available in situ. You have to go there, and most of them are in the regional language. So I quickly discovered that it was hard to do the kind of internet research that we do because they are simply not available. So when you go to Jagannath, there is a 10-volume set on the Jagannath Puri temple, not available elsewhere. You can't find it online. Sthala Puranas of Tamil temples are written in Tamil in very slim volumes, so you have to end up. So I started by saying a lot of research would be done, but the research would be done in the choice of the temple and in the planning of the trip, whether to plan it during a festival or not, trying to find a contact in the temple because we're going there for 2-3 days. You'd want to speak to the priest. You would want to speak to the local scholar. So the research was mostly logistical in finding experts in the place. And then going there, talking as much as possible to 10 different priests, 10 different scholars, usually somebody from the board of trustees who happened to be a historian of that temple, and then buying as many books locally as was possible, and then coming back and actually doing the research and sifting through the mounds of. The beauty is in religion is there's so much material available, Amit, in India, because even the humblest of temples will have the Sthala Purana. So then the question becomes, it's a curating job really, it's reading up on everything and figuring out what is it that I want to say about all this. So that it doesn't end up becoming another descriptive book on a Sthala Purana. So the point of view became really important. And so, but here's something I'll tell you. If anyone in your listeners, I know you have a ton of listeners. If anyone in your listenership is wondering about faith and is saying, you know what, I'm 35 years old. I got laid off, my startup failed, whatever it is. And I'm trying to figure out if I have it in me to become one of the faithful. I would say, give yourself an experiment of visiting 10 temples in 2021. And it doesn't matter which. Choose a large temple, ideally an ancient temple. I will guarantee that it will raise questions in you. I will guarantee that it will change you. You may not end up faithful. I am not as devout as I would like to be. I think, though, this experiment of visiting temples in sequence in a consistent way with discipline will change you. And I think it's a good experiment to do, because places of faith are very special because they have had imprints from hundreds of thousands of people who have come there carrying fears, hopes, and dreams. And you can say what you like, but that makes the place sacred. That gives the place its gravitas. That is why it is a place of worship, where you speak with your soul and not with your head.
So I'm kind of both atheist and agnostic and not that open to faith, but I would say this is terrific advice anyway, because I think, and one gets sort of a rich feeling of this through your book. And I imagine anyone who does visit any of these temples, especially at a time when there are lots of pilgrims and so on, will, get a better sense of the necessity and the impact of religion and maybe a deeper understanding into our culture and so on. And I don't think faith needs to necessarily be a part of that experience in terms of becoming faithful yourself. But, as an experience, I think it would be incredible. Another thing that I loved about your book, like when I first got your book, I have to be honest, I looked at all these chapters and they all have the names of these places. And I thought, okay, she's gone to each of these places. She's going to describe the food. That's great. I'm going to enjoy that. I didn't expect more, but I got much more. And one of the things I got is that through the book, you are sort of meditating on these deeper questions, which have often, cropped up in my own thinking, and some that haven't. So how I'd like to kind of structure the rest of this episode is examine some of these deeper questions first, and then we'll talk about these specific places and the mouth-watering food described there, because if we talk about the food first, people might just go off to eat, and who's going to listen to the rest of the episode? So
yes.
My first big question again comes from, something that you said right at the start, that you are becoming more of a Hindu in terms of, Hinduism playing a part in your life, but you're also a feminist, and that's a big part of who you are. And it's inescapable that so much of Hinduism, and of course Hinduism contains multitudes, which also we'll discuss. There are so many things that are so beautiful and deep and inspiring, but there are also so many misogynistic elements to it. I recently reread Yuganta by Iravati Karve, which is a fabulous book about, her feminist take of our epics. And you've also mentioned during this time that you've been traveling that there are no women priests, and at various places there are restrictions on what women can or cannot do. How did you reconcile all of this for yourself?
Frankly, I haven't, Amit. The hypocrisies and the misogyny and the male predominance in all Hinduism for sure, but every faith is, you can't escape it. I told you my father passed on recently, and the priest, in an attempt to explain the rituals to us, he said, our Vedas say, Kashya Marana Mukti, which I knew. You die in Kashi, you will attain Mukti. And if you don't die in Kashi, what is the antidote to that? To die in a place where your son is. And I have two girls, and I'm a daughter, and I'm thinking, what about the daughter? And so it at every stage. And for example, the daughter is not supposed to do all the cremation rites. I have two girls. I hope they will do it for me. And the certain mantras called the Rudram. There is a japa. Rudram is a very famous Shaivite mantra. I asked the priest, why do you say only males should chant the mantra? Why can't a woman chant? And he sort of said, he said it in Tamil. He said, Ningle Parvati Madri, you yourself are like Parvati. Why do you need to chant? I didn't buy that. So I am very attuned to the hypocrisies of faith. I think religion is important, but the religious, the closest, the people who have high levels of religion, the pious, are full of pettiness and hypocrisy. And it's hard to turn away from that. And I really don't know how to wrap my head around it, Amit. I think the only way to do it is that with everything that is great comes pettiness. Picasso was a great painter, misogynist to the core. Paul Gauguin is an impressionist giant, left his family in France, ran away to Tahiti. Vincent van Gogh had madness in him. So the only way to resolve it is to have this holistic view that life is this way and you take the good and leave out the bad. But that doesn't mean that I have been able to look away from the hypocrisies.
And also, what sort of you've pointed out at various points in time is through this book is the presence of caste. For example, you write about one temple where the Brahmins are eating separately. You talk about, at one point, the 5 great sins of Hinduism, which include killing a Brahmin. And of course, you point out that, like almost everything that has come about in the religion, is kind of contextual. It was meant to be 5 rules for people who are living with their guru in the Guru Shishya Parampara. And therefore, there was, one of the other rules was you shall not covet your guru's wife. And extremely specific. And throughout the temples, as you describe, you do see this, that there is sort of, Brahmins are elevated in this kind of a way. And again, this is one sort of, ugly aspect that one can't help noticing. And if any of my listeners are sort of wondering why I'm stressing on the negative aspects, these are just the 2 which struck me because they lead to cognitive dissonance. And there are many other good things which we'll also talk about, including the food. Again, would your approach to this be the same as to the misogyny, that, you don't have to accept the whole? There are some things which are wrong with it.
Sure. So caste is a big topic in India, and I try to stay away from it in my book, but it's hard to, Amit. I think that the gift of being an immigrant, you know what? Underneath, at the DNA level, we are all the same. I have a barbelled approach to this whole topic. One is that I don't believe even in all this national identity and boundaries. At the DNA level, we are all the same. But I do believe now in what I have come to call the tribal identity, which is something that is linked to rituals, it's linked to milestones of your life, it is linked to community, and it can be your building community. It is not about, or your village, so it comes from this whole village notion of this is my community, but currently it's my housing community. So I believe that there is a place for community, but I also believe that we are one. At a DNA level. So then how does one reconcile with caste? The way I actually was able to reconcile with the caste notions that predominate faith and religion, what helped me was dealing with craftspeople in India. I have a love of textiles, and I was going around for a website that I created called Project Loom, where we documented handloom clusters. And when you go to Kutch and you talk to the weavers and the dyers, or when you go to Kanchipuram and talk to the weavers and dyers, it is entirely caste-based, Amit. They say it without any shade of judgment. There is none of the political overtones that we associate with it. It is, they do this type of embroidery in Kutch. This caste does this type of embroidery. This caste is a dyer. This caste is, and I know the Tamil words for it, but I forgot the Gujarati words for it. But I said, wow, their identity is linked to caste, and it is not about, I can sit in an ivory tower in Bombay or Bangalore and say this is all wrong. But we are a long way off from destroying these segregations that have come about so naturally for these craftspeople, and they still live in that way. So actually working with craftspeople is a way to wrap your head, as Laila Taibji has done, as Archana Shah, who founded Bandage, has done. So they understand in a very intuitive, very easy way that this is how it is in India. And the overtones that we give about the hierarchy that we give is absent there. It is kind of a lateral thing. So that is one way to resolve it in your head if you are viscerally against this varnashrama, as they call it, as I am. So that's a good way.
I had a great episode on this with T.M. Krishna, which I'll link from the show notes for all my listeners. Moving on to something, that I do sort of deeply admire about the culture of this country, which I guess in a sense you can call Hinduism also, because it can just mean so many other things, which is the incredible diversity. And one of the things you point out is not just diversity in the traditional sense that we have, so many thousands of gods, just like the biggest buffet ever. You choose your god depending on what your proclivity is. But also, this is not just a diversity across space, it's also a diversity across time. Like you point out that, we have these animistic traditions which survive, these paganistic traditions that survive. It's like, the last 30 centuries of, this subcontinent's evolution in religious terms all exists till today in religion. And you've also seen, different aspects of this in the same place. It's not that Puri is just one kind of thing. You point out about Puri that the origin myths of Puri go to Jainism, Buddhism, to different sects of Hinduisms. Everyone's got a different origin story. That's so incredibly fascinating. So tell me about your experience, because at an intellectual level, we of course know that the diversity is out there, but you experienced it at a visceral level as well. So tell me a bit about that.
So the incredible thing about India, but if you look at it through my lens, is that gods still roam the earth. And I mean that quite literally. I mean men and women dressing themselves as gods and taking part in a procession. If you go to the other great hotbeds of civilization, which came up with philosophies and ideas and invented faiths, Egypt, for example, Greece, for example. If you go to Greece, nobody prays to Zeus. Nobody prays to Athena or Apollo or Aphrodite. They have all but disappeared. Greece has cut itself off from its past that was so powerful. I mean, it shaped Western civilizations. But you go there now and that country has just cut itself off from that past. You go to Egypt, which was the sort of the Fertile Crescent where Egypt, the rivers Nile and Euphrates were the seat of where it all began. But you go there, Ra or Horus or any of those gods, absent. And Egypt, if you go to Cairo, they have shorn themselves of their past. India, happily, we still wear the clothes that our forefathers wear, that you now only see in the Museum of Metropolitan Art, all the robes. We still have traditions which continue, and rituals and superstitions and links to seasons. So in that sense, the long arc of civilization has not ended in India. The narrative continues. We are not at the last chapter. Whereas Greece, what happened was they had their chapters as Zeus, Hermes, everything, cut. And now you have Harry Potter, this, that, and the other. It is a chasm in the middle. Whereas in India, it is a gentle arc. And to quote Martin Luther, the arc is long, and I think it will bend towards justice, even in our current political cauldron. So I am very proud of India, that all our faiths together have figured out a way not to cut ourselves from the past. The sacred and the profane live concomitantly in India. We have not cut ourselves from that. So that's wonderful. And you see that everywhere. I was talking about this firewalking ceremony, Amit, which touched me so deeply. It happens in Shivaji Nagar, which has one of the most powerful churches in Bangalore is there, and the feast happens there. It is largely occupied by Muslim merchants, and the Hindu group, what happens was the goddess comes into a man on Amavasya night, the new moon night. He dresses himself in a fabulous Kanchipuram sari. He believes he's the goddess. He wears lipstick, he wears makeup and turmeric on the face, and he walks around the neighborhood collecting money. And there is a group that follows him, me included. Religious fervor builds up, and then they all end it with him walking over fire and a lot of dancing and shaking and ecstatic devotees walking behind him. And then inside the house where he enters, there is a mound of meat, and this goddess, he calls himself Angala Parameshwari, which is a very old tribal goddess before Saraswati, Lakshmi, all that came about. And he takes arms full of the meat and puts it into his mouth and distributes it to his devotees. I mean, this is like a Tolkien book or some sort of a Steven Spielberg fantasy thing. Man dressing as a woman, you have the cross-dressing and the all the things that my daughter talks about now as being politically relevant. the him, his, the gender, everything is contained in this. So how can you tell me that this religion, as it is practiced in India, is not relevant to the questions of our time? If a man can become a woman for one night, if a human can become a god for one night, if you can convince yourself to walk over fire and then nothing happens to you, if you can serve meat as an offering, as a prasadam, in this whole vegetarian mafia countries that we've sometimes become, it's all there. You just need to know where to find it.
Yeah, I'm non-vegetarian, so armfuls of meat sounds really nice to me. Talking now about a different kind of diversity, which is food diversity, and which is another sort of a positive impact of all these different sort of temples and the cultures that they preserve. And at one point in your wonderful chapter on Puri, which was one of my favorite chapters from your book, you write, quote, "It is easy to be flippant or cynical about temple food. The same list of dishes cooked in the same way over centuries, feeding masses of people via the Lord. What other virtue does it have? An important one has to do with the preservation of indigenous seed varieties. At the Jagannath temple, for instance, one of the offerings is made with green paddy. For green paddy to be available throughout the year, specific seed varieties that ripen at different times must be grown around the temple. At the very least, this promotes biodiversity. India used to have 1 lakh varieties of rice. Today, most of us eat basmati, and in the south, Sona Masuri rice. Temple kitchens specifically choose local and indigenous varieties of rice, such as matta and jawara, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, red rice and parboiled." Stop quote. And this reminds me of something that, Vikram Doctor, when he was did an episode with me a couple of years back, spoke about Cavendish bananas, where he, spoke about how we imported bananas out to the US, and then they sent us back this homogenized version of the banana called Cavendish bananas, which has spread everywhere because of reasons of, economies of scale and marketing and so on. And all the local varieties are drying up. But then it strikes me that when one speaks of all these temple cultures and the food that is around them, one, they evolved to make use of local produce, because back when you could not travel so much, that's all that you had. And two, therefore, by becoming ossified, and ossification is generally a bad thing, and I'll come to that as well, but by becoming ossified, we are actually preserving the sort of food diversity of our country. Is there something to this? Do you think religion also plays a part in a sense of keeping something alive, something good like food diversity, which would not otherwise have been the case?
Not just food, Amit. Cultural traditions, the clothes we wear to temples are mostly saris. I mean, nowadays, as somebody who loves handloom saris, where do young women wear saris? To the temple and for weddings. So Yakshagana is preserved in temple festivals in Uttara Karnataka. David Shulman wrote this wonderful essay for the New York Review of Books on the Kudiyatam, which happened in temple premises, where you create the universe and destroy it in 31 days. So this is a play that goes over 31 nights, and it happens in temples. So temples are cauldrons of culture and tradition. And I think we who have become sanitized and removed from our faith have forgotten that along with the hypocrisy and along with this preaching and becoming religious, they are the ones who are preserving, as you say, the food. The Paini Panchamridam uses a particular type of banana called Malavarapuram, which is, as you said, not found. You have Gelaki bananas in Bangalore. You don't get that. But thanks to that temple, if you visit Paini, you will still get this bananas that are indigenous and local. And the Ambalapura Palpaism uses the parboiled rice. And so temples, I think, or places of faith, preserve music, preserve dance, preserve textiles and rituals and food. So yes, I think that we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater in our attempt to become agnostic. We forget all the good things they've done as well.
My next question is really about a cultural difference between countries. Like, religion can play the same role in all our lives. Back in the day, it probably originated as the god of the gaps. Whatever you don't understand, you use religion to explain it. And over time, you understand more and more. It, all over the world, religion plays the role of sort of, forming communities where people find comfort and, the good aspects of being part of a tribe. But there's something about India that's different. Now, for a moment, I'll take you back, and this is a diversion. So I used to be a professional poker player once, and I would spend a fair bit of time in Macau, where I would go to play tournaments. And Macau, by the way, I think about 15 years ago, overtook Las Vegas as the biggest gambling destination in the world, partly because the Chinese love to gamble. So I remember on a weekday afternoon, I went to the Venetian there. And the Venetian in Macau is not only built to be a replica of the one in Vegas, but it is the largest gaming floor in the world, right? There are rows and rows and rows of slot machines and all of that happening. And I went there on a weekday afternoon and the place was packed. And it was old Chinese pensioners who are standing at those slot machines and they're sitting there for hours and hours and hours and they're gambling. And it's a big part of the culture there. I mean, if anyone from China is listening to this, I hope I'm not simplifying. I'm just sharing an experience and not saying that all the Chinese are necessarily like this. But I got reminded of this when I read this passage in your book where in your chapter on Udupi, you write, quote, "The elderly in China play mahjong. American senior citizens go on cruises and play golf. Europeans visit museums, tour wineries, and dine at Michelin-star restaurants. Indian elders visit temples." Stop quote. And elsewhere in your book, you've spoken about how people often have this urge towards the end of their lives that they want to die in Kashi. You know? So tell me a little bit about this, because this does, to an extent, seem something that is much more an Indian thing than, is it because we have less sources of comfort and solace and so on, because not many of our elders can go around on luxury cruises and dining in Michelin-star restaurants like European elders may be able to do? It seems that in this sense, the role of religion is so much deeper here than elsewhere. Do you think that's true?
So I have a theory, and I don't know if it's true, Amit. I have a theory that it is because of the trajectory of our economy that we are in, that religion still holds sway. And I wonder if we become richer, like, say, China or Taiwan or Japan, whether wealth will engender us to forget the gods. Because I think you have to be, in some senses, a developing country for religion to take hold. So that is my macro theory, is that the reason religion holds sway in India in the way it does, it has to do with the economic trajectory or the point in the economic trajectory that we are in. Once our GDP goes up and once we become like, say, Japan, perhaps we will forget faith, as many rich countries have forgotten, and we will find other inventions that seek to soothe us. So that's my answer to that, yeah. And I think it has more to do with economics than to do with geography. It has to do with the time on the graph, where we are at that point in the graph. And I think Europe used to be like that. Every country in the that had, if you follow the economic trajectory of every country, I feel, and again, this is my theory, is that there were points in that economic trajectory where the countries were deeply devout and religious. As they became wealthier, they gave up their faith, and they became more scientific, they became more rational, and they found money served as well as a god as religion did when in their past. So India is still not there yet.
No, I have spent far more time in casinos and in temples, but I sincerely hope that our elderly don't go from temples to slot machines. That would just be horrifying. Which might have kind of happened elsewhere. My next question is about the commercialization of religion, which you've written in separate parts of your book. Like at one point in your chapter on Palani, you write about how the way, devotees are treated, and it's such an organized setup and all of that. And at one point you write, quote, "I have tried long and hard to make my peace with the hierarchical structure of Hinduism and indeed all religions. Perhaps I should just bring them down from the pedestal, bring them down from the realm of the divine to the realm of the commercial, view them as a spectacle." Stop quote. And much later in your chapter on Jaipur, you write, quote, "I haven't figured out my stance with respect to offerings for God. Flowers will get crushed, sweets will aid and abet India's rising number of diabetics. And really, does the God partake of all this stuff? The offerings of money, clothes, food, or flowers end up in the pockets of the priest or the temple. So why do we persist carrying these objects as an offering to God when he doesn't need a thing and only wants us to be pure of heart?" Stop quote. And I'll point out to all my listeners that it is Shoba who used the pronoun he for God. I didn't do that. I always reflexively say she, just to be on the
nice
safe side.
Yeah. Good one, Amit.
So is this something that I realized that there was a lot about this experience, especially the food and the sort of, the other almost mystical experiences which were amazing. But at the same time, you are viewing and writing about and commenting on all this crash commercialization that's happening in a separate part of the book. You write about, I think during the Kumbh Mela chapter, you write about how everything in Haridwar is it's a setup for the tourist. So you'll have an American and a Swiss and whatever, and there'll be people giving them gyan and all of that. Does this commercial aspect of this whole religion thing disturb you a bit, because you have true believers flocking to places which may, for all you know, not be manned by true believers at all?
Yeah. Very good question. But does Subodh Gupta deserve to be India's millionaire artist? There are countless. Does Vasudev Gaitonde deserve to sell for how much he fell far much after his death? So if you are an artist, as I was trained to be, commercialism is always a stepmother, and you always view it with suspicion. Stepfather, okay, view it with suspicion. So that said, I will answer it in two ways. One is that anything that we consider pure and otherworldly comes with commercialization that we will always have trouble dealing with. And I used art as a very specific example to point that out. There are countless deserving artists who don't achieve the stature that all these so-called name brand artists do. So how do you make your peace with that? The great thing, and this is true with art and this is true with temples, is that even today you can go to Bhubaneswar in Orissa, you can go near a river and you will find a small yogini shrine with nobody there, not even a priest. And I have visited this shrine which was destroyed. And you can commune with the divine in silence and solitude. That is available to you. Even today in Kerala, you can go to temples where there is a priest, there is no hierarchy, there is no money grabbing. And so then the question becomes, do you visit the rock star temples of Tirupati, Haridwar, Badrinath, Dwarka, the name brand temples, or do you forget them? I would say if you are like me, uncomfortable with the commercialization of the temples, just don't go to those temples. Don't put your rupees as part of their coffers. Don't visit the big temples that have countless tourists anyway. So then the next level becomes, if you also believe, like Diana Eck wrote about in her book, that tirthas or places of worship carry energy, and part of the pilgrimage is to experience this energy and perhaps get healed by it. That's the purpose of going to that big temple, the Guruvayurs, the Kumbh Mela, and everything, is to get your energy and your healing from your energy that sounds it. So, like with art, you choose your battles and you choose if you are sick, if you want to be healed from, God forbid, a cancer, and by all means, go follow your faith. If your mom tells you go visit Guruvayur, go and get the healing energy from it. But if you just want to commune with the divine, as lovers of podcasts, Amit, including yours, I'm sure you have listened to Sam Harris's podcast. And how can you explain meditation? It is a felt experience. It's not hard to articulate. So if you want to just have the felt experience, go to Bhubaneswar, see the Yogini temple, go to Maharashtra. Every village outside Bombay has small shrines where nobody will bother you. So you can experience the non-commercial aspect of faith if you want to. And in fact, you may experience faith in those non-commercial shrines, the roadside in Nashik, where there is a shivling and a beautiful banyan tree. You go sit there and experience the wind, and you may be touched in a way that you can't articulate. And that, to me, is an experience of the divine. And the beauty is that wherever you are, you can access it. Even in Italy, where Christianity was played such a huge role, and all the Baroque images of Christ are now in the museums. You go to Florence, you can go to the museum, or you can go to those giant cathedrals in the Vatican, or you can go to a small church, listen to the Vespers singing, and be touched by it.
Well, there's such wisdom in that, being able to relate to religion in all our personal ways. And you mentioned Sam Harris. I should point out to my listeners that I'm by the way, a big fan of his podcast. I think he's again a master of the craft of the interview. whatever one might think of his views otherwise. But I actually downloaded his meditation app. I think it's called the Waking Up app, and it's a subscription thing. And I've been paying for it for the last 5 months, but haven't actually sat down for a single session. So it's like you take a gym membership for a year and then you never go. Just as there's writer's block, I guess there's meditator's block. So sort of my last big question before we get to the food, though I'll obviously keep throwing up tangential questions even when we talk about the food. But this last big question is about, you've spoken throughout your book, and it's a truism, almost a cliche, that Hinduism contains so much. There is so much within it. But what we have seen in the last few years and building up over the last few decades is political Hinduism, or what is called Hindutva today, which is a very strident version of Hinduism, which almost tries to mimic sort of the Abrahamic one book approach. And it's strident, it's full of certainties. It's also built on negatives. Instead of a positive view of what the world should be like, it's built on negatives like, no love jihad, don't slaughter cows, and so on and so forth. And some of their political grievances might well be legitimate, but a lot of what they stand for is having a toxic effect on our society. So what are your sort of feelings on what's happening out there, and should Hindus be outraged at what is being done in the name of Hinduism?
I think you should. I am, certainly. And the problem in India now, and I have a friend who's the resident editor of Times of India in Bangalore, and she was saying that families in India are being torn apart because of what is happening. So you have the mother who says Jai Shri Ram when the Babri Masjid judgment was passed, and you have the daughter who is horrified by the same judgment. We didn't used to be like that. I think what is happening currently is that when you promote faith over national identity, it is a very slippery slope, and I think I personally think it is a very dangerous thing what we are doing. I think what I say in the book is a person and if I can read it out, I would, Amit, is what that parliamentarian in Goa said, that he's a devout Hindu, but inside his house, but outside he's an Indian first and a Hindu last. That's how it is, I feel. That's a good way to view religion. Faith is private. Faith may happen in temples and churches and mosques and public, but in a sense, what are you after at the end of the day? You want to connect with the divine. You want to connect with your God, be it Jesus, Allah, or Ram. And why are you drawing your community and warrior craft and statescraft into this, what should be a very private, solemn, sacred act?
Yeah, and you said, Jesus, Allah, or Ram, and that immediately reminded me of another sort of question that I had for you, so I'll ask it now, which is that, the thing in Hinduism is that there are so many deities to choose from, and indeed there are deities spread across this book. At one point you speak about your experiences in the US, where, there was this fight between South Indians and North Indians about which deity to have for a temple, and the only one they could actually agree on was Ganapati. And just thinking about all the different choices open to you, there's Ram, Vishnu, Shiva, Ganesha / Ganapati, Lakshmi, Durga, and so on. And it strikes me that the way that you choose a favorite deity, like apart from it coming down to you like a football club, loyalty often comes down to some people. But apart from that, if you actually choose it, it sort of strikes me that it reveals something about the chooser, much in the same way that we choose who is our cricketing hero. So, my cricketing hero being Rahul Dravid, for example, will no doubt reveal something about me, and so on and so forth. So which deity do you feel most drawn to, and why do you think that is?
Kali, very easy. Kali Ma, because I think she's dark in a country that worships fairness. She embraces her shadow in a way that Lakshmi and Saraswati and all the goody-goody gods don't. She's more tribal and links to the fertility goddesses of yore. So she connects us to who we were as a civilization. And she's a fierce warrior goddess. So I love that. I love the female warrior goddesses. And so I have to go to the Northeast, which I have not done.
Fantastic. Maybe a separate book on that. Let's now talk about some of the places that you visit through the book. Not all of them, because we do want people to kind of buy the book, which they should anyway, because I don't think a podcast episode, however long, can capture more than a sliver of it. But your first chapter is on Udupi. And of course, we all associate Udupi with the cuisine and all of that. And I was struck by your beautiful description of the classic iconic masala dosa as, quote, having a quote, sly filling to stymie orthodox Brahmin priests. Stop quote. So can you elaborate on what the filling of the masala dosa has to do with fighting Brahmanism?
Yeah, sure. So this I got from a book by Geeta Rao. It is on Udupi cuisine. Basically, what happens was Orthodox Brahmins are not allowed to eat onion. So the plain potato filling was kept outside, and they would eat their dosa and almost dip in the potato filling like a chutney. But they wanted onions. So these priests, they figured out a way to slyly have their cake and eat it too, or have their onion and eat it too. So they made this masala filling with onions, and then they would fold it into the dosa so that they could piously eat this, thinking that nobody knows that they are eating onions. So that was how that was invented, according to the research I did. And I loved the idea of it. And now, of course, Udupi masala dosa has become a global commodity. It's a GI tag, I'm sure.
Yeah, so all casteist people listening to this will now be forced to stop eating masala dosas if you are true to whatever your ideals are. And I was fascinated by, the description of how basically, there are 8 spiritual centers in Udupi who run the temple 2 years at a time. And during the transition, they do what is called Anna Brahma, where they feed, 15,000 people, which is quite mad. And you've described their delicacy as being brinjal cooked in coconut oil, which is one of their specialties. And I was kind of amused by this because on the one hand, you point out how they don't want to use foreign ingredients. So everything has to be local and sanskari, as it were. But at the same time, they're cooking this with red chilies, which come from Mexico, and sesame seeds, which, went from Indonesia to China and then to India. And that irony sort of amused me of how, it is impossible to be purely Indian in that sense in any way.
Except in Shraddh cooking, Amit. I think that If you look at the death rituals around, or what they call the Shraddham or the Shraddh, I think even today, the funerary rites, and I discussed this with a scholar actually, the funerary rites in Hinduism are better preserved than the marriage rites, for example, or the other life stages rites, because people are afraid of the bhoots and the pishashas that we become. And so this element of fear forced them, the priests and the Brahmins who were in charge of passing it from generation to generation, to preserve the cooking associated with all these death rituals. Not so much with as you say, the temple cooking even was diluted. And certainly marriage food at one point had certain prescriptions which are no longer valid in this day, where we have stalls with pav bhaji in Indian and South Indian temples. But funerary cooking is still preserved in the original form.
And another thing that struck me, and this is sort of a profound observation you make at different points in the book, and it seems to me to be true of religion fundamentally, that all rituals that evolve for specific local reasons, but then are given a veneer of morality or myth. For example, at one point you point out how, again I'll quote from your chapter, quote, traditional Hindus in Udupi don't eat certain foods during the 4 monsoon months, a tradition of abstinence that seems at odds in this age when New Zealand apples and Malta oranges are airlifted to every region of India. They call this Chatur Masya Vrat. The phrase means 4-month austerity and perhaps began out of necessity. You have to hunker down in one place during the monsoon, and certain foods would simply not have been available. The protocol itself seems rather strict and forbidding, but intuitive once you get used to it, stop quote. And later on you talk about the myth that built around it, where you say, quote, Narada asked Brahma, the creator, about the importance of the Chaturmasya Vrata. Brahma said, and now these are Brahma's words, so quote, Chaturmasya is a period of 4 months during which Lord Vishnu is believed to take rest in the Ksheer Sagar or Milky Ocean. So quite naturally, all the oceans, rivers and ponds are believed to attain divinity due to the presence of Lord Vishnu during this period, stop quote. And this is something that seems to crop up in different parts of your book, where different things evolve in the religion because of what are local factors, but then almost as if to rationalize them and why they are part of the religion, all these myths and all kind of get built around. So is this a pattern you started noticing more and more while writing the book? And,
Yeah, 100%. And the biggest example of that, of course, Amit, is the gods that were originally worshipped, which was Indra, the god of thunder. So every faith, even the choice of gods to worship is a pattern. Every faith was invented, I believe, in the face of natural danger by roaming nomads. So if you look at Zeus, for example, was the lord of thunder and lightning, and here you had Indra, who's now dropped once. I think electricity was invented and houses were invented, and we were not so worried about thunders and rain. Indra lost his mojo, as it were, and then so now the gods of the moment, Murugan, though Muruga is an old god who has tribal roots. Shiva is a newcomer, and Vishnu in the long span of time. So I think this inventions that happened around faith fascinate me because they made sense. For example, again, there is one tradition where after a child is born, for a certain number of days, the family should quarantine essentially. And even today, I know Hindus in my building complex who follow that without realizing that tradition that rule probably came about because of infection, and that doesn't exist anymore. Even today, my mother, after going to pay a condolence visit to her friend, will come back and take a bath. Again, invented because if you go in a village to a place where there were dead bodies, the danger of infection. But we have these mindless things that we follow that don't make sense anymore. And once you get into this religion, you will see, as you just pointed out. That said, the Chaturmasya Vrata, I kind of defend it now because it's no different from the paleo and the keto diets that we follow. I think eating certain foods for a month will tell you what your body is capable of digesting. So I have no quarrel with that. But you're right in that the macro point you make of inventions becoming irrelevant and still being followed exists in all over India.
No, and in fact, I've followed both the keto and the intermittent fasting at different points in time. And the thing with intermittent fasting is that all religions have some form of fasting or the other built in that is actually good for the body in different ways. And religions figured this out, and they may have built other mythologies and stories around it, but it's the right thing to do. And I'll leave my listeners with an interesting exercise before we move on to the next point, which is that think about it and make a list of traditions which you know of for which the original reason no longer exists for why it might have evolved, but they sort of continue to the present day. And I'll move on to my next question, which is from your Kashi chapter, where I loved your first paragraph, so I'm going to take a tangent as we get there, where you write, quote, "A dead cow is floating down the river Ganga. She is a black and white Holstein Friesian cow like the one I own in Bengaluru. She floats sideways, legs spread-eagled. Half of her face is visible even though it is dark. 7 p.m. I wish I could say that she looks peaceful, but her teeth are bared as if hurt." Stop quote. And this is a delightful para by itself, and partly because of, that half sentence like the one I own in Bangalore. And that's, of course, something that you've written an entire book about. So, so that our listeners can get familiar with a little more of your work and not just this book, let's take a brief tangent while you tell me about your fascination with cows and how you came to own one.
Thank you, Amit, for plugging my previous book, which is called The Cows of Bangalore in India and Milk Lady of Bangalore in foreign countries. The book is about how a woman who sells milk in Bangalore to the army cantonment opposite my house, she would bring a milk can and sell it, approached me one day and said, "Do you want to buy fresh milk?" And I was used to Nandini milk packets, and I decided I would buy fresh milk from her, and we became friends. And later she approached me and said, "I want a loan for 60,000 rupees to buy a cow." And she does the hard sell and says, "You should be lucky that I approached you, because the Jain family who live below you would have killed to get a cow, but I'm asking you instead." So there was all the hard selling happening. And then here is where the long arm of tradition touches me. My father and father-in-law at that time were both turning 81. And everybody in the extended household all my aunts were saying, "You should do Godan," which is very, very important for this particular life stage. So I said, maybe God is handing this Godan thing in my hand. And of course, all these prescriptions say the Godan has to be the Desi cow to a Brahmin. Sarla was not a Brahmin, she was a woman, and Parkai from a Desi cow. But I did it anyway. So what I did was I gave her a loan, which ended up becoming a gift of 75,000 rupees to buy the cow and then continue her business. And I gave her the advance that was paid for the book as a kind of a thank you as well. And it was a wonderful exercise in writing the book, and it also began as a series of columns. I think it really touched people because I had readers who came in from Delhi and who said, "I want to donate 30,000 rupees to this woman." And I suddenly thought, oh God, they shouldn't think I'm doing this commission business. So I've had people who met Sarala who are from my readers and donated to her. So this book is about Sarala, but it's also about why cows are so important in Hinduism, to the point where the common word in which priests begin an invocation by asking for your gotra. Gotra means cowshed. Which cowshed do you belong to? That's the root of the word. And of course, all the rivers, Godavari, Govardhan, Gokul, any word that begins with go has a link to a cow. And that's why cows, if once you start looking, are steeped in India. And again, the fascinating thing is, why are we obsessed with cows and not the Bos taurus is a species that originated in Turkey. You go to Turkey, nobody cares about cows. So again, why have we preserved this? The Vedas begin with a verse about the cow, and the sunrise is portrayed as the sun rose like the cows walk out of cowshed. So in poetry, in scriptures, in colloquial language, cows are everywhere, and we have somehow managed to preserve it. And now cows are part of politics, which is the sad part.
But, the rhetorical question that you just asked, is there an answer to it that why are cows so sacred for us? Why do cows play such a, a big role in our society, so much so that, even Mahatma Gandhi wrote about it in Hind Swaraj and so on. So it was a political issue for a lot longer than recently. In fact, all of the pet issues of modern political Hindutva, whether they are love jihad or cow slaughter or whatever, have been issues for like more than a century now. What's the big deal? Like, I'm trying to think of the proximate local cause for it. Like, was it the one domestic animal from which they got milk and they placed a lot of value on that, and there was all those factors fed into it? And why us? Why only us?
So the nomads worship the horses because when horses eat grass and they pull it by the root, so you have to move on. Every civilization, whether it is Indus Valley or Mesopotamia, had animals that were part of their milieu. So ostensibly you could have the goat as the primary animal instead of the cow, because the goat gives milk as well. I think in India, the reason we worship cows is that we figured out ways to use cow dung, to use we figured out ways to make every aspect of the cow count. A fermentation, I think, using the dahi, not just the doodh, but the dahi and the buttermilk. I think the killer app was the ghee. I think Indians invented ghee and enshrined the cow, and that was it. That was the fork in the road, Amit. We created ghee, and that forever then, since then, the cow was holy and sacred. So again, it comes back to food.
As someone who's just gotten back on the keto diet and was on it for a long time a couple of years ago, I'm happy to say that I'm quite happy to consider ghee as something holy. But I'm not sure that, my reverence would extend to the source of the ghee. My next question is about the Ganga. Now, you've kind of pointed out about how, in your chapter on Kashi, about how the state of the Ganga, which we don't need to elaborate upon. You start the chapter with a cow floating. Later, I think there's a dead buffalo somewhere, and people are dipping themselves with a dead buffalo right next to them, and so on. And you talk about the different myths and origin stories, like the Bhagavata Purana myth and all of that. And again, I was kind of wondering about this deification of the Ganga as a holy river. Would it possibly come about because the people whose narrative version of Hinduism, quote-unquote Hinduism, won out over the centuries were the people who lived in the Gangetic Plain? Like, I did an episode with Tony Joseph, who wrote that wonderful book, Early Indians. And in that, he points out how that, basically till 2000 years ago, till about, 0 BC or 0 AD, I don't even know what to call it, but till that year, there were centuries of intermingling between all the people on the subcontinent. But then a particular school of thinking about religion wins out, and that's a school of thought which is strong in the Gangetic Plain, which is why when you look at the DNA records from back then, you see there's a lot of endogamy, which is why, David Reich once said that the Han Chinese are one big population, but Indians aren't one big population. They're a collection of many, many small populations because of the endogamy brought about by the caste system, which was a profound and mind-blowing insight for me when I heard about it from Tony, and it's scientific fact. So could part of the reason for why the Ganga, got this holy status is because of that, because the people who were living there their narrative was a winning narrative for, all these centuries.
Yeah, history is written by the winners, is what you are saying. And you're saying, I hadn't quite thought of it in that way, because when you live in South India, the Ganga does not loom as large in your imagination as it does if you lived in the Gangetic Plain. But it totally makes sense, Amit. And as you know, in the book, I've also asked, if you venerate this river so much, how can you handle this pollution? How can you pollute? And I think the thing I came up with was the idea of pavitrata and gandagi. The river can be dirty, but she's still pure. And in India, as with many cultures, including Russia, we have this iconic image of a bird with two heads facing in opposite directions. We call it Gandaberunda in the south. And I think that idea of pavitrata and gandagi is an excellent example of a two-headed bird who is able to hold two contradictory ideas in your head. And I also ask in the book, I said, would the Ganga have been better served if she had been a he, if it had been a son instead of a daughter? Because again, with this whole focus on the boy child in India, would we have taken better care of this river had it been a male? But these are speculations. All our rivers are women, and we call her Mother Ganga. And a mother is somebody you take for granted. You don't fear a mother. So had it been a father or a son, would we have taken better care of this river that we all so love? And so again, I don't know the answer, but I raised the question in that chapter.
And that image that you painted in that chapter about, all these people taking a holy dip in the Ganges as there's a dead buffalo floating just besides them, it also struck me as a powerful metaphor for how we normalize all that is ugly about our society. That for these people, the buffalo is invisible to them because they're in the holy Ganges. And similarly, in our society, we are surrounded by so much that is ugly and toxic, and it doesn't exist. It's the unseen, as it were.
Yes.
Do you think that it makes sense at that level?
I've thought about this a lot, Amit. I think, why are we so outraged by Catholic priests being pedophiles? I think anything that religion does, we tend to think of it as the purveyors of faith to be more pure, more holy, more good. We ascribe a morality to the people who are surrounding faith that perhaps it doesn't exist, as we have discovered time and time again in every faith. It is the mullahs who are issuing the fatwas. It is the holiest of men who are raping children. And here it is the Hinduism correlation too exists at multiple levels. So is it a fallacy is what I'm asking. Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should say that humans who practice faith and are devout are just as bad as the rest of us. Maybe the argument itself is flawed. Or what we ascribe to them, we expect them to be holier than thou when they are not.
Fascinating. Let's move on to the slightly more cheerful subject of food now, where in this chapter on Kashi, at one point you write one among many delightful sentences in the book. You write, quote, Chopin's nocturnes have nothing on the twin sounds of a jalebi and a kachori sizzling in oil right next to each other, stop quote. And a little later you write, quote, an impassive man ladles aloo sabzi into one leaf bowl and the kachori in another. Now comes a dilemma. How to balance these two bowls in one hand and eat with the other. The others around me are doing just fine, having years of practice. Stop quote. And obviously, mouth is already watering, even though I'm on keto and I can't have all of this. But this is, tell me your experience, eating this food and, how all of that was.
I wish I could be a Kashi-vasi, Amit. I would move to Haridwar or Allahabad or any of. I think I could live there and just for the food. And Kashi, especially, you go to the Sankatamochan Hanuman temple, you have the pedas, and every morning you have these beautifully dressed male priests who wear just the dhoti as it should be worn, with the kache in between your legs, and little L's on top, which is again makes sense for a tropical country like India. And on a tangent, you go to Tamil Nadu, which is the hottest state, and you have these little young boys with tight jeans and full sleeve shirt, and you're thinking, what are you thinking? Why don't you wear a dhoti like all your ancestors did? But that's my pet peeve with respect to textiles. The food at North Indian temples to me was amazing, perhaps because I grew up here in the south and I used to the paisam and the neyyapam and everything. I found Jaipur to be a fantastic food town. I found Kashi, definitely Haridwar. They would be my top three picks. Puri, the Bhog, is what is most famous about it. But again, because they make an attempt to hold on to the root vegetables and tubers that are indigenous of India and also the spices that are indigenous, I would say it is simple food and not the spicy food that I like. So Puri's as a food town, as a food temple, it fell a little below Kashi. But Kashi was a gastronom's paradise. I mean, Haridwar too.
Yeah, yeah. And you've also spoken about how, peras can be considered by some as a fertility tonic. And, someone told you, quote, a good pera should make your tongue clap. Stop quote.
Yes. Yeah.
And you...
I'm not one who likes sweets. I think if like you said earlier, my desert island food or last meal food would be a samosa or a kachori. But yeah, I would make an exception to this peras.
Wow. Okay, I'm not a desert person either, but if I ever go to Kashi, I promise to try the pera. You also talk about there's sesame rice, besan ka shira, and thandai with bhang. So, there was a time, and I'll take this tangent to ask you a question that, thandai with bhang gives the impression, and bhang, of course, is from the cannabis plant, and gives the impression of Hindus and the religion as being really chilled out, having fun, and you go back and you've spoken about how there is so much erotica, not just in Khajuraho and Ajanta Ellora and wherever, but even in our myths. And you've quoted some stuff about, very raunchy action between gods that is happening, which I won't read out now because who knows, we might have a family audience. Are there children listening to this? And so what kind of happened? Because, you get the sense that there is sort of one way of interpreting Hinduism or living Hinduism or living the culture of our land, which is full of fun, which is joyful, which is, embracing the sensual pleasures as they often still do with regard to food. But at the same time, there's also a clash between a certain kind of almost a new puritanism that has kind of come up, which frowns upon all these pleasures. What's your sense of this evolution? Are the two coexisting, or is there actually a kind of a clash between them with one losing out?
So I think it was a clash. My answer and my theory would be it was a clash of the civilizations, and I would blame to a large extent being colonized on it for the reason for the Puritanism. I think that when you had colonial masters whose gaze was very different and who ascribed value judgments to the way we dressed and the way we lived, even today, the white man, as an immigrant, I can tell you when you live around white men, you develop a complex that somehow you have to live up to them, and there's a certain sense of inferiority. So I think colonizing India, you can say the British gave of the railways and tea culture and everything, but they just took away a lot. And one of the things they took away was our sense of unself-consciousness about our body and the clothes we wear, this prudishness about the breasts and the body and the saris and everything. And as you point out, in the book, the sensuousness of faith was lost, was shorn, was cut off literally because our colonial masters would not have any of it. The Victorian norms that they were used to, where if the body was bound and corseted and sort of, we say in India today that the girls are asked to, cover their bodies and everything. I think that Victorians handed it down to us. Before that, you see some of the old photographs of tribal women, it's very self-confident, it's very accepting of their own body. So I would blame the clash of the civilizations when the colonization of India happened. That led to this, as you say, call it Puritanism and prudishness.
No, absolutely. And this is something many people don't realize, the thing that this prudishness is somehow sanskari, as it were, part of our culture. I read a great episode on Kerala with Manu Pillai, where he spoke about this as well, that, till we were colonized, the women used to walk around bare-breasted and, it wasn't thought about as something erotic or something that will make the men lose control or something that should involve any kind of shame. And all of that changed with the Victorian values of the British, which somehow magically then became part of our sanskar. So I'll kind of not look at the next couple of chapters in detail, though I love them. In Ajmer, you talk about Kesariya Bhat, which is all vegetarian, but there's also the story about how Shah Jahan mixed, the blood of a Nilgai or a blue bull in there. And you also talk about how Akbar started this tradition of the Bari Deg, a cauldron so big that you could feed 15,000 people from that one cauldron, which was delightful. In Palani, you write about the Panch Amritam, or the five nectars, and again how they are composed is all local circumstances, and it's all automated production now, which is, with the changing times. So once upon a time, people used to prepare it by stamping on it. Now, I was interested by something that I read in the chapter after that, which is about Mumbai and which is about the Bene Israelis. And there, right at the start, you speak about how you were talking to an aunt of yours about Jewish people, and she wasn't so familiar with them. And then you had to tell her that, do you remember in Kochi, there was a place called Jew Town where the Jews were from? And she remarked, quote, Jew Town, where good cardamom was available, stop quote. And that association of a people with a food, how strong is that in different parts of the country? And I don't just mean a religion with a food, but different peoples in different places with certain kinds of food. And the other danger that then comes about is the danger of essentialism. Now, when we are describing something, it is natural to try to get to the essence of it. For example, when you write about the Sikhs, that one of the beautiful things about the Sikhs, which we think of and which fills even me with emotion when I think of all that they have done, is their langars, their, that whole tradition of service, of feeding people and all of that. And you've pointed out different things about each of the religions which are native to that. So on the one hand, you can look at these these attributes that you associate with a religion, or particular foods that you associate with a religion. But where do you cross the line into essentialism, where you're simplifying too much and perhaps do a disservice to the complexity of a tradition? Is that something you've thought about?
Yeah, I think the essentialism comes about when you have to explain the faith to a mass audience, not a follower or a group that is local and standing in front of you. I think what happens with television, the media, or now with YouTube, where people are looking for takeaways. And I do that too in my book. I end each chapter with the takeaways. So once you get into this takeaway culture or life hacks or anything, you are forced to explain, you are forced to leave out the nuances for the soundbite. So I think that when you get into that culture, what you say becomes the norm, Amit. And the question is that good or bad? And I don't think you've raised it, but I haven't made up my mind about it. Because on the one hand, it would be great for me to understand the Parsi faith in one paragraph, but that would be essentialism. It would leave out all of the nuances out of it. But at least I would have a semblance of some knowledge on it. I think, unfortunately or fortunately, we are moving towards a time when this will become more and more, Amit. Because as you know, there are apps that say, oh, don't have the time to read a book. Here, read a paragraph and we'll condense it for you. Don't have the time to scan magazines, we will give it to you. And there's one called Blinkist, where you blink and you get some knowledge. So essentialism is a feature of our time, I think. It is hard to escape it.
Yeah, perhaps both a feature and a bug in different ways. And in that chapter on Jews, you talk about how they share halwa with us. And a delightful little throwaway line about how chicken soup is sometimes known as Jewish penicillin, which, speaks to the medical properties, and how a particular ritual that they have involves what might well be poha. So that's interesting to me. And also how, Chitravan Brahmins might actually be Bene Israelis, similarities such as, Aptekar and Apte. And Aptekar is, by the way, a name from there, and we might have adapted it to Apte. So that's a very interesting speculation which listeners might enjoy. Let me move on to now talking about...
if I can interject. So to your point about chicken soup and penicillin, in Tamil households, when a child falls sick, we give them rasam. And one of my pet projects is to find out what different states or regions have as their chicken soup, quote unquote, the proverb. I mean, what would a sick child in Maharashtra get, for example, or in not even Maharashtra, leave, say, Kolhapur or Nashik or different parts. For example, what would a child in Kerala get? Probably a fish gruel, some sort. So that would be a fun exercise to go to different parts and find out what is the equivalent food that you give when a child is sick, the gruel or the rasam.
That's so
What did
fascinating.
you get, Amit,
As a
when
kid,
you were sick? Specifically to when you were sick.
Shoba, I'll confess to you that I got chicken soup. That's, that's the privilege of growing up in a certain kind of family, I guess. But, I love rasam and I'm interested in finding this out. And can I ask our listeners if they have answers to these questions to maybe write to you on Twitter or something, tag you on Twitter
That
or
would be
something?
fantastic. What did you eat as a kid when you were sick? What did your mom give you? Not even what you ate. What did your mother give you?
What a wonderful question. Yeah, so please, guys, you heard it here. Please tag Shoba and let her know. Maybe we'll just start a thread with it so it's all in one place. I'll now move on to, another of my favorite dishes, which is, again, now just talking about it and reading your description of it is tempting me to come out of keto, which is when you talk about Madurai and you're talking about the prasadam there. You talk at length about dosa, why the dosa there is so incredibly unique and all of that. Tell me a little bit about that.
In Madurai, it was one of the few temples where it was a savory prasadam. And as I've told you before, I prefer savories to sweet. So that's what blew me away. But also that it was unusual. And I asked the priest there, why have you chosen this dosa? This dosa is the one that's offered to God is about the size of a tire, a car tire. The one that is sold as prasadam is about the size of a personal pan pizza. Or maybe slightly smaller. But the one that is offered is huge, and it is deep fried in ghee and contains all good things. It was my favorite prasadam to eat. So I asked the priest, why did you choose this dosa? And he said it is a larger version of the Tirumal Vadai that is given to Lord Balaji in Tirupati. So this was a kind of a borrowing of a tradition and making it your own. And the other thing that I loved about this Madurai Alagar Kovil is that it is not a rock star temple, but it has a hoary history. So I went with all good intentions to write about Meenakshi, the warrior goddess who rode a horse and conquered armies. But then somebody told me about this other temple with a more interesting prasadam, and that's what made it to the book.
And what's your favorite kind of dosa? Because my friends in Bangalore and Chennai will often argue about what is the best kind of dosa and so on and so forth. And I love having dosa in Bangalore whenever I go there, especially MTR and all, and actually any place out there, Adigas, MTR. I just love the dosa there. You don't get stuff like that in Bombay. Where
if you want my
stand?
list, you should go to CTR or Central Tiffin Rooms. They have a very good benne dosa. You should have idli in Brahmin's Coffee in Chamrajpet. But the dosa, you should go to Vidyarthi Bhavan or CTR.
Wonderful. And I'll again take another tangent from sort of the subject of food and, quote a paragraph that you've written in that chapter on Madurai, which I found fascinating because it underscored a point I kind of keep making, that the kind of work that you do shapes you. For example, I wrote a post about this in my newsletter about how the form that you choose to work in will shape your work, and therefore the work that you choose to do will shape you. So a simple decision about what form you take can change the person that you are. For example, I have to think differently when I'm doing a 3-hour long form conversation podcast than if I was doing like 15-minute things. I think my thinking on any subject would be far shallower then. And I was reminded of that by this fascinating paragraph from that chapter. I'll read it out. Quote, in a 2015 paper published in the journal Neuroimage, a team of scientists from the Center for Mind-Brain Sciences at the University of Trento, Italy, studied the brains of professional Vedic Sanskrit Pandits in India who were used to memorizing and reciting 40,000 to 100,000 word oral texts and discovered, and now this is a quote from the study, massive grey matter density and cortical thickness increase, that quote stops, in the brains of the Vedic priests, somewhat similar to what was seen in London taxi drivers in previous studies. The paper, which is available online, is fascinating not only because it describes how the Vedic priests' brains changed, but also because it talks about the subjects and their training. Stop quote. And I don't really have a question here, but I absolutely loved your observation after this, that these are not people who could have gotten that grey matter because they got it in their genes and they descended from some particular family or whatever. The boys were more or less picked in a kind of a random way. They could just come from anywhere, and obviously these are boys only, and they could really come from anywhere. And their brains changed because of the kind of study and the work that they did, which is so fascinating to me and something that I just wanted to point out to listeners, that the things that you do shapes who you are in, fundamental ways that can even be physiological. So this was quite a sort of a TIL moment for me. You have any, further thoughts on this?
Yeah. So this is something Wendy Doniger points out in one of her books, Amit, is that she says India as a civilization has Shruti literature. She differentiates between Shruti and Smriti. Shruti literature is just heard literature, and that's how it was transmitted for hundreds of thousands of years. And Smriti is when it started being written down. And her point was that the Shruti literature was preserved unchanged with the meter and the way of intonation for hundreds of thousands of years, contradicting the point of view that says, if you want to remember something and if you want to preserve it, write it down. So India was a living example of how a culture preserved many texts, all the Brahmanas, all the Vedas, for hundreds of thousands of years just by listening. So we as a culture have a propensity for remembering things, and we should not squander it. Even the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the oldest books in the world, it was preserved as writing on stone tablets. There was no oral passing on. Whereas here in India, we passed on orally our music. It was all oral. So as a culture, if you believe that there are traits that belong to a culture, oral listening and remembering is one of ours. And we should seize it and embrace it and make it our own.
Yeah, and maybe we should kind of make a conscious effort to do it. Like my writing students will often tell me that there are so many good apps. I can use Grammarly or the Hemingway app, and should I do that? And my answer always is that if it helps you, please use it. If it brings value, please use it. But at the same time, you have to learn to think for yourself about what is good writing and what isn't, and how you want to write. And, you can't lose the ability to
Yes.
sort of think for yourself, as you and I have been forced to do for
Yes.
so many years in writing hundreds and hundreds of columns. So after your Madurai chapter, you had a great chapter on Jaipur, an interesting brief chapter on Goa, where I was struck by this quote, which I'm going to ask you to elaborate upon, where you quoted Gerard de Cunha once telling you, quote, "Portugal did Goa a great favor. We were cut off from the shackles of Indian tradition. We were forced to look outside." Stop quote. Tell me a little bit about this, and I presume at least part of this is in the context of food. And just another aside, I remember when I would spend time in Macau. Macau was also once colonized by the Portuguese, and I'd actually noticed some similarities in certain items of theirs and what you could get in Goa. So, but, just elaborate on his point for me, because again, I found this quite fascinating.
Yeah. So, Goa is a place that all of India loves. I think my view into Goa was shaped largely by the late great Wendell Rodrigues, the designer, who showed me how in his own village in Kolwale, the ancient tribal traditions coexisted with the Hindu past and a Christian present. And what Gerard de Cunha said about Portugal, I think what my takeaway was from his quote is that anytime you have Portugal, in a sense, made Goans immigrants in their own land, because you come in as a conqueror and you enforce certain norms on the people. And then what happens is, as citizens, you're forced to choose between your master and your traditions. And a lot of Goans chose Portugal as their mother tongue. I quote Mario Miranda saying, "Portuguese is my mother tongue." So what ends up happening, to differentiate it from, say, Kerala, where the colonizing was more religious with St. Thomas and everything, was that Goans felt very adept and easy about adopting music from Portugal, clothes, the language, and it cuts off the shackles of the past, is what he was saying. And anyone who goes to Goa today can even today see it, because you see they're very avant-garde in their thinking, in the fashions they follow, restaurants they open, the life they lead. It's a very symbiotic culture which has a little bit of the Portugal influence, a little bit of the Hindus, a little bit of the Christian. So it's a very joie de vivre. So I loved it. And I think that's why most Indians love Goa and go there often.
Yeah, it's a fascinating example of being exposed to the world without actually having to go anywhere. It's almost kind of right here.
You said it better than me.
No, I can't say it better than you. Your book has so many wonderful moments. I'll quote another bit about food to get back to food, because who can resist it? And this is from your chapter about Thiruvananthapuram, which has a subtitle of "The Elephant God's Fried Dumplings." And you write here about Uniappam. And you say, quote, Kottarakara, before I embark upon this quote, all my South Indian listeners, please forgive my pronunciations. Do remember that I am, after all, an Amit. Okay, quote, Kottarakara temple is known for its uniappam, or fried dumplings made with rice flour, coconut, jaggery, ghee, dry ginger, cardamom, and quish banana, a local variety known as palayam thodan. They are loosely mixed in giant vats and fried in ghee or oil on a slow day. The temple makes 50,000 such dumplings, a number that can rise to 170,000 during festivals, according to Mohan Thirumeni. Unusual for temples, these uniappams are cooked in front of the deity in an alcove rather than in a separate secret chamber. And in another part in your chapter on Puri, you've written about the sort of elaborate work that goes into making their chappan bhog. The chappan bhog, by the way, has 56 ingredients, which is why it's called chappan bhog. The Amit in me is useful now. Chappan is 56 in Hindi. And you speak about how, quote, no outsider is allowed inside the temple kitchen except the 1,000 male cooks who make 56 different kinds of offerings called chappan bhog to serve to the gods 6 times a day. The list of dishes isn't just 56, it runs to the hundreds. The Lord, along with his family, likes variety. The sweet dishes alone are of over 50 types, including several types of laddus, malpua, kheer, and roshagulla, making this a diabetic's nightmare. Thankfully, there are also boiled rice dishes, lentil-based ones, vegetable curries, and their permutations and combinations. Food is central to worship in this temple because, you see, Lord Vishnu dines here. Stop quote. And I'm just fascinated by the scale of this. Like, we often read about how, churches in Europe were built to be so grand because they wanted that to give, devotees a sense of how grand religion is, so that they would feel that sense of awe towards their God. And just reading about the kind of scale at which this kind of cooking is being done. And it's not just these 1,000 cooks. Later on, you point out about how the kitchens are spread out over an acre. And you have 200 junior cooks who are not allowed to enter the kitchens, who are doing the prep work, and they are grating hundreds of coconuts while chanting the name of the Lord. They're also chopping vegetables. This is crazy. The scale is mind-blowing. Although you didn't go into the kitchen in Puri, you did enter many of the other kitchens. And you also, of course, in the West, entered the commercial kitchens of some of the best restaurants in the world. Give me a sense of how that feeling was about entering these kitchens, seeing this work.
So remember that experiment I said, go to a temple during the course of this year if you just want to see if you have it in you to become faithful or devout. I would say start with Puri because it is a majestic, marvelous temple in every sense of the word. It is a temple with a history and an amalgamation that is so fantastic. Has every faith that was prominent in India of the time being part of this temple. And as far as the cooking goes, it is very tantric. You couldn't enter, but they have 752 chulas or wood-fired stoves. Underneath each of the chulas, I'm told, is a tantric design with many triangles. And the cook, one of the most poignant things during that trip was one of the priest cooks, the Suaras, told me that if I think even for a moment that I am the one cooking, the 9 pots will shatter. Because actually it is goddess Bimala who is cooking the food. And he, it's hard to convey that in a book, but he actually believed that. He wasn't, his stance, his eyes told me. So to me, that is a sublimation of ego. In many temples, Amit, the priests become holier than thou. They think, I'm doing Lord's work and therefore I am holy. But whereas I think when you are cooking temple food, you don't have the grandiosity that comes with a priest who stands and does the chanting and throwing of flowers in front of God. So in a sense, remember we talked about being holier than thou in not having the hypocrisies and the petty egos. Temple cooks have that. That you want to experience divine sublimation of the ego through humility in the presence of the divine, talk to the temple cooks. And in Jagannath Puri, especially, because they believe really deeply in the tantric notion. There are 9 pots. 9 is a very prominent number in Hinduism. You have Navaratna, Navarasa, Navagraha, the planets, and they have 9 pots stacked on top of each other on these wood fires, and they each cook, and each of the families are able to sell it and make money off of it. These temple cooks, I found what I was looking for and what we talked about earlier, which is where you're truly humble, authentically humble, and not kind of showing off and saying, I'm a messenger of God and therefore I'm better than you. These guys actually had a taste of the divine, literally and figuratively.
Wow. I guess just cooking, just chopping endless vegetables or whatever the processes are is a kind of sadhana in itself, I guess. If you're just
There you go.
like a physical meditation almost, you're just,
Yes.
doing the same thing again and again. I also love the chapter on the Kumbh Mela, and I have a question based on that, where at one point you quote this gentleman called Swami Avdeshanand, where he's talking about diversity, which you've spoken about before. And he says, quote, Hinduism is a very diverse religion with many paths to God. Puja, meditation, yoga, pranayam, pilgrimages, fast, chanting, and satsang. The Kumbh is where all this diversity comes together. But more than this, I was struck by something that, again, the same Swami Avdeshanand ji said a little before that, where he says, quote, the Kumbh Mela is a symbol of our secular democracy in action. For example, most of the Hindu religious offerings used in the Kumbh are packaged by Muslim craftsmen, and the music bands have Muslim and Christian performers. Stop quote. And elsewhere you speak about how, at Ajmer Sharif when you go, or in the churches of Goa, Hindus are taking part everywhere and they are kind of sort of involved. And so it seems to me that whereas in politics we have developed almost an exclusionary view of religion, in our culture there is an embrace of, of everything. And this seems to me to be a strange kind of contradiction. I mean, I remember I once had politician and thinker J.P. Narayan on my show, episode 149, and I said something about India being an illiberal society because of the misogyny and caste and whatever. And he said, no, it's also, if you look at it another way, it's also a very liberal society. Because in our lived experience, the way we assimilate everything from everywhere, in that there's also a lot of tolerance there. And both of these are, of course, true. But what is your sense of going to all of these places that, is the only view of religion you see this open, warm embrace that takes everybody in? Or do you also sort of see the other side of it?
Yeah, I'll go back. First of all, I'm blown away that you remember that J.P. Narayan was episode 149. So you clearly have a phenomenal memory for things. Compliments on that. But to answer your question, I'm going back to the Ganda Berunda, which is the eagle who's with two heads looking and on either direction. And I think that we are, I would agree with Mr. J.P. Narayan that intrinsically, if you are born in this earth in India, you are raised, it's part of the water we drink and this tolerance. And I'll give you specific examples. I think revealed preference, they call it in economics. My mother, for example, when the Babri judgment was passed, said Jai Shri Ram. And you see her, she is a devout Hindu. But because my brother had many Muslim friends, she visited their homes and became friendly with them. So I think that if you look at the way these festivals are done, I wish I could attend Bombay's Ganesh Chaturthi, but I'm told it's the same there, where the craftsmen of all faiths make different parts of the giant idols. And for example, the chariots are made by. So I think that on the one hand, we have the politics of religion that is being used to win elections. But in Bangalore, where I live, Hindus attend infant Jesus and pray to the mother when they want children. The Ajmer Dargah is Ganga Jamuna Sanskriti, as they call it. I love Sufi music. If you see our lived experience, it's hard not to be tolerant and embracing of all faiths, because guess what? They have so much to offer. How can you not partake when it's available to you on offer? And in India, we have the glory of multiple faiths and their inventions. Why you'd be stupid to not absorb? And I think Indians do. It is, and I think the Indians who live in communities where all the major faiths are jostling side by side, their experience of India is very different from ours, who watch the news and therefore form opinions about the politics of religion and without much of a lived experience. So I think, yes, I agree with Mr. Narayan that as a nation, we are deeply tolerant, and that will eventually be our salvation.
Yeah, I did an episode with Aanchal Malhotra recently. She's written that remarkable book on partition. And one of the sort of points that came up there was that when we hate each other, what we are hating is abstractions, an abstract notion of the other. But what we embrace of the other are all the concrete little things.
Yeah.
And to me, a lot of these concrete things are, there in the food, where, what we eat is actually the most assimilative melting pot that you can possibly imagine. And one would hope that one day Indian politics can become a little bit more like Indian food. So, I've taken enough of your time and I'll let you go soon. And also, just direct all the listeners to please partake in the feast that is in your writing in this wonderful book. Did writing this book sort of, what were your big learning moments during this book? You went in obviously already knowing a lot about food, having a deep sense of the history, having a sense of the nation as well. You've been to many of these temples before. But, are there any big sort of learnings for you or revelations for you or insights for you or anything that deepened your understanding in the process of going to all of these places and immersing yourself in these experiences?
For me, it was that the importance of ritual. And I saw it in temples, I saw it in the church, I saw it in the one Islamic shrine that I visited. And I think that if there was one thing that I have changed my attitude towards, it is that I believe that humans invented rituals to mark milestones in life, to mark transitions from one stage of life to another, to mark a celebration or a sorrow. And in urban India, certainly, and if you are of a certain rational, I would humbly say, Amit, much of your audience, much of your listenership, such as myself, where you live in the mind of in the cerebral world, we are in danger of giving up rituals. And again, you are throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Yes, sure, rituals have superstitions that may seem nonsensical to you. But when you are disdaining ritual, as I once did, and when you are saying they are superstitions and intolerant and, are based on planetary transmutations and things like that, you also give up rituals that are linked to when a daughter leaves home or when a son goes to college, something to mark that. It is so much a part of us. If you go to Chennai airport, people welcome somebody with a garland. That is a ritual. And we don't do that. So-called educated people, we've stopped that. When a woman is pregnant, the neighbors bring her favorite foods. That is a ritual. So I would say, if I had a plea or an entreaty to your listeners, I would say, find your rituals and, figure it out and make it up if you must. But we have such a rich vein of rituals in our culture. Find one that you like. Okay, if you are not a Shiva worshipper, find a rock, collect a few rocks, every day pour some water over it and then pour it on your Tulsi plant. That's a ritual. That will give you calm. It will give you the meditative state that Sam Harris so applauds. And we have it. Why not use it?
Wow, you've given me, through the book and through this conversation, you've given me so much to think about and process. Shoba, thank you so much for coming on this show.
Thank you so much for having me, Amit. Yours is a podcast I've enjoyed so much as a listener. It is a privilege and honor that you invited me to come on it. And I'm deeply grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, head on over to your nearest bookstore, online or offline, and buy Shoba Narayan's wonderful book, Food and Faith, A Pilgrim's Journey Through India. This will be linked from the show notes, and our other books will also be linked there. You can follow Shoba on Twitter at Shoba Narayan. You can follow me at Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.